Blessed are the meek? No. Smite your enemies with the hammer of Thor and feed their bodies to vultures. That's a direct quote from the man who wrote a credo called the 14 Words. He died in prison serving 190 years. And if you're in the Christian nationalist world, you've been closer to his ideas than you think. If Adolf Hitler was a Christian prince, if National Socialism was a Christian movement, then I have a very simple question. Why aren't any of his successors Christians? I've spent 6 sessions reading through 80 years of post-war Nazi movements, documented, sourced academic history, and every single one of them ends up in the same place, throwing out Christ. They're not confused about it, they're not hiding it, they're saying it out loud. They say Christianity is a subversive Jewish religion, that Christ was a rabbi, and the cross is a symbol of weakness. And for many of them, Wotan or Odin, the Norse father god, the all-father of the Aryan race, that's who they actually serve. Now that's not me editorializing, that's the chapter. Because today we're covering chapter 13 of Black Sun by the historian Nicholas Goodrick Clark. The chapter is called Nordic Racial Paganism, and if the previous chapter showed you the fantastical, mystical side of post-war Nazism, the UFOs, the Hollow Earth, the Hindu avatars, and the angry, violent side in skinheads and white power music, this chapter shows you what happens when both those ideas truly hit the ground. 3 figures anchor the story. First is Wyatt Kaldenberg. He called Christianity the theology of self-hatred and said it, quote, devours the structures of our inner self. He was at least consistent enough in his hatred to say the Holocaust shouldn't be denied, but rather celebrated. That's a lot more courage than a lot of men into these ideas are willing to show. Second is Jost Turner, a Vietnam vet who came home broken and went looking for meaning. He found the Hindu guru Paramahansa Yogananda, lived in an ashram, and ended up building a National Socialist commune in Northern California called Volksburg. That's where he practiced swastika-posture yoga, swastika-sana, directed by an allegedly immortal Himalayan guru toward white racial evolution. Turner tried to syncretize Norse paganism with Hindu Kriya Yoga into a system he called Aryan Kriya. If that sounds insane, guess what? It is. Because once you throw out biblical theology, you've got to go shopping, and you end up in some very strange aisles. Third, and most importantly, David Lane, the author of the 14 Words Credo I mentioned earlier, which says, quote, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. Lane was a convicted murderer who died in prison serving a 190-year sentence, and he's the man who rewrote the Beatitudes with the hammer of Thor. Now here's what makes Lane more than just another white supremacist in prison. The 14 Words became the single most recognized white supremacist slogan in the world. Lane wrote it from a cell, and it spread everywhere, into graffiti, tattoos, memes, and comment sections. He spent decades in prison producing revolutionary writings that radicalized a generation, and he ran a publishing house from behind bars, the 14 Word Press, and he used it to publish the work of Miguel Serrano, a Chilean diplomat who served as ambassador to India, Austria, and Yugoslavia. We've covered Serrano in detail in a previous session. In brief, Serrano believed that Adolf Hitler was a divine avatar who survived the war and escaped to Antarctica. That's not a joke. That's a real diplomatic official of a real country who built an entire religious system around Hitler as a divine being. David Lane published Serrano's theology in English for the first time, right as the internet was going mainstream in the year 2000. And if you've ever seen Hyperborean memes, Black Sun edits, or references to Agartha and Hollow Earth floating around online, as I've shown many times, that's Serrano. That imagery traces directly back to his system, and David Lane helped put it into English before the internet put it into your feed. So the 14 Words didn't come from some isolated angry guy in a cell. They came from a man who ran an international publishing operation from federal prison, who was connected to a global occult ideology stretching from Chile to India to Austria, and whose work now has a delivery system reaching millions. Every time you see those 14 words in a comment section, in a meme, on a tattoo, or in a Telegram channel, that's David Lane, a convicted murderer and a cult and esoteric Hitlerist publisher. And here's the answer to the question I asked earlier. Why aren't any of Hitler's successors Christians? Because every single one of them, Kaldenberg, Turner, Lane, Serrano, and countless others, understood that Christianity and their own worldview cannot coexist. They saw the collision clearly, and they chose. Total depravity says there is no health in us. Repentance says you might be wrong and need to turn from it forever. Our own heart's desires might be deceiving us, and the whole system demands that a man take every thought captive to Christ, not to himself. That runs directly into the man who says, "No, I decide. I am the standard. My will is my law." And these white racialist pagans saw that collision head on. They didn't try to smooth it over. They said, "We reject the God who demands this, and we're going to find our own God, one who looks like us." Now here's an interesting fact. If you squint, Wotan kind of looks like Yahweh. Father God, all-knowing, presides over a warrior people, demands loyalty. It's a convenient substitution. You get to keep the feeling of serving a Father God without any of the parts that require you to humble yourself. No original sin, no repentance, no Colossians 3, no fruits of the Spirit, and no Savior nailed to a cross. And also, conveniently, no James chapter 3. If you've read it, you know why that's a problem for men whose entire public witness is built on what comes out of their mouths, the tongue that defiles, the wisdom from below versus the wisdom from above. Read James 3, then go scroll the timeline of any influencer who talks about white identity and civilizational decline while calling himself a Christian. The wisdom from above is peaceable, gentle, open to reason. The wisdom from below produces jealousy, selfish ambition, and disorder. James says you'll know the difference by the fruit. So, look at the fruit. Now I want to talk about some numbers. 1488. That's a reference to David Lane's 14 words plus 88, which, depending on who you ask, either stands for Heil Hitler with H as the 8th letter of the alphabet, or David Lane's own 88 precepts, his treatise on race and politics. You've probably seen the number 1488 on X. You might not have known what it meant, but there's another number, 1183. That one's been floating around Reformed Christian circles. It references Stephen Wolfe's 11 words, quote, "White evangelicals are the lone bulwark against moral insanity in America," plus 83, which stands for Hail Christ. 1183 showed up on Christmas ornaments produced by Ethan Holden, aka the Jolly Brawler, alongside an image of the United States from the front cover of Wolfe's book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. Here's the tweet. Someone posts the ornament and credits Ethan Holden. And Holden replies as a little secret message near both coasts with a coy smiley face. That secret message, the numbers 11 and 83. And here's a compilation of accounts using 1183 as a single number in 4 successive digits. Credit to Hitler Hated Christ for providing these images. It's worth noting that Ethan Holden's brother Samuel also made the White Boy Summer video, the one that featured Lincoln Rockwell, founder of the American Nazi Party, among other Nazi imagery. 1488 for white supremacists, 1183 for Reformed Christians. That is not a coincidence. That was a message, and some received it loud and clear. And if I were Stephen Wolfe, I'd want to know that someone stamped a number modeled on David Lane's 14 words onto a Christmas ornament next to my book cover. But I'd also want to ask myself why the men who are doing this feel comfortable in my orbit, why they feel like my work gives them permission, because they clearly do. And that question deserves an honest answer, even if only to himself. And frankly, that question isn't just for Wolfe. It's for every pastor, every podcaster, every influencer in the reform world who has guys like this in their comments, in their DMs, in their conferences, and has never once stopped to ask, why do these men feel at home here? What am I saying or not saying that makes them think this is their room? In fact, just this week, the pastor Brian Sauvé was in the Jolly Brawler's replies, joking around, making fun of a man's weight. "Let me cook," he says. And the Jolly Brawler calls him brother and calls the target, Dean Lentini of Underdog Theology, a slanderer and a deviant. Now, this is the same account that produced the 1183 ornaments and whose brother made the White Boy Summer video. And a pastor is in there laughing. And that's what I mean by silence. Sometimes it's not even silence. Sometimes it's active encouragement. Now I want to speak to 3 groups of men. To the Norse pagan guys, the Odinist guys, the Oshatru guys. I respect that you have the courage of your convictions. You've rejected Christ and you're open about it. We disagree. I think you're headed toward destruction, but you're honest about which road you're on. That's more than I can say for some people. To the reform guys who are staying silent, by now you see this. You see the 14 words in the comments. You see the memes. You see guys in your orbit picking up ideas that come straight out of the book I've been reading for the past 3 months. And you're not saying anything because you don't want the drama. You don't want to lose friends or followers. I understand that. But Carl Jung, a pagan mystic, diagnosed this in 1960. He told Miguel Serrano that the weakness of Orthodox Christianity creates the conditions for the Wotan archetype to erupt again. That weakness can face left, yes, but it can also face right, and your silence is that rightward weakness. Steve McNallen, a pagan, had the courage to throw the Nazis out of his Oshatru Free Assembly and let his movement shatter. Are you telling me a pagan worshipping Icelandic gods has more spine than you do? And to the guys actively laundering these ideas through Christian-sounding language, you know who you are. Some of you know exactly where this comes from. Now, some of you are several steps removed and genuinely don't, but you need to find out. The meat you're eating, the stuff you're trying to separate from the bones, is rotten. It was rotten before you got it. If you don't know that, please, as they say, do the reading. If you do know that, repent. None of this is new. That's the thesis of this entire series. The ideas that feel edgy and fresh on your timeline in 2026 were put together by convicted murderers, occultists, and esoteric Hitlerists decades ago. They've just been repackaged. The first 50 pages of Black Sun are free on Kindle. Download them. Read them. If you recognize anything in there, buy the book. Don't take my word for it. Now, one correction. In the recording of this live session you're about to watch, I said the number on the ornaments was 1483. That was incorrect and an honest mistake. It's 1183. Precision matters when you're making claims like these. The receipts are real, and they speak for themselves. Let's get into chapter 13. Okay, everybody. Welcome to the final Black Sun study group, reading club, book session as we complete our journey through the book Black Sun, Aryan Cults, Esoteric Nazism, and the Politics of Identity by Nicholas Goodrick Clark. So thank you so much for those who have come along with me on this journey, both on Substack and those who have joined us on YouTube and elsewhere. I'm very, very excited to conclude this session, to conclude this study with what I think are going to be some of the most familiar and impactful chapters of the book. And so, because I can imagine that for those of you that have engaged with this material for the first time, whether you've read the book or whether you've just been listening to the series, let's just go through the chapters. American neo-Nazism, maybe you've heard of Lincoln Rockwell, or maybe you've seen his photo or kind of dimly seen some images of that era. You probably don't know much about the British Nazi underground, Colin Jordan. Maybe you've heard of Julius Evola, or some people who are into Julius Evola. Imperium and the New Atlantis, probably not. Savitri Devi, we almost certainly haven't heard about. If you're approaching this material casually. Wilhelm Landig, no. Maybe you've seen images of Nazi UFOs. Miguel Serrano, definitely no, and hopefully you've enjoyed learning a bit about him. Maybe you've heard about some white noise or black metal kind of bands, but never really explored the music. Maybe Nazi Satanism, some of that darker stuff associated with neo-Nazism in the 1990s, like Edward Norton in American History X. You've probably seen that image. You're familiar with that. And Christian identity, maybe some people who have been Christians all their lives have encountered some of the ways the gospel has been twisted and perverted to talk about things that it doesn't. Maybe you've heard of British Israelism, stuff like that. But as we get into chapter 13, Nordic Racial Paganism, if you've been at all part of the masculinity discussion, the part of the manosphere for any amount of time, you've almost certainly encountered guys who are into Nordic paganism. And so the term paganism, can refer broadly to a set of anti-Christian practices. So in a sense, Buddhists can be considered pagan. But when it talks to Nordic racial paganism, we're talking about we can call them the indigenous religions of Europe before Christianity moved in. So the indigenous religions of Northern Europe, Germany, the Nordic countries, stuff like that. So that's what Nordic racial paganism is. And I can tell you from having been in the manosphere, that was a huge subject of discussion. That is an enormous community. And so we're going to be talking about that, and that's going to probably be familiar to many of you. And then we have chapter 14, Conspiracy Beliefs in the New World Order. And chances are most of you listening have encountered some of the names that are going to show up in this chapter. Chances are you know of some of them, you've heard of the beliefs, certainly. And then we'll get to the conclusion, the politics of identity. And I think when we actually get there, you're going to see that, again, I stress over and over again, this book was published in 2002. Writing it probably took 2-3 years, something like that. I can't imagine how long it would have taken to research and write. And so the things that he's talking about in this book, published in 2002, are so incredibly relevant to today, 25 years later. And what you're going to hear me say over and over and over again in this session is none of this is new. None of this is new. What's happening online today on X, not so much on YouTube, but mostly on X now is where it tends to live, pretends as if these are all things that we're all just waking up to and discovering. And maybe for some people that's true. But what this book demonstrates, and why I push this book so hard, is because while there certainly is a layer of people, a layer of people and a layer of men mostly, who knows how thick it is, who are discovering these ideas for the first time in the post-COVID era, I can tell you, and this book proves with extensive sources, that the ideas that these young men are discovering have been around since the 1950s and 60s, that they have a rich genealogy, lineage of names and writings and websites and albums and all of that different stuff. That there has been this fertile soil of intellectual, and in some sense pseudo-intellectual, intellectual, spiritual, and other traditions that has just been fermenting in the underground of American culture. And so certainly there are a lot of young men who are discovering this stuff for the first time and are maybe several steps removed from the center of it. Maybe they genuinely have no idea who Julius Evola is. Maybe they don't know Miguel Serrano. Maybe they don't know Lincoln Rockwell, right? But the thing is, when they're coming into large rooms or online communities, Gab, Discord servers, Telegram channels, and who knows where else, there are people in those groups who know and are familiar with these ideas. And they may not be sharing where they got these ideas from, but they know, for sure they know. And there, as this book demonstrates, and again, I encourage you to, let's see if there's a bibliography in here. I don't think that there is. I think there's footnotes. Let's see, there's endnotes. But yeah, no bibliography. I wish that there was a bibliography, but you can see, I don't know, there's maybe 1,000, footnotes, something like that. There's 70. I won't add them up right now, but there's somewhere between 500 and 1,000 endnotes in this chapter. And so it's all very well sourced because Nicholas Goodrick Clark is an academic and he's citing primary sources. He's not citing studies of the primary sources. He's citing the primary sources. So there's a rich wealth, so to speak, of textbooks, not textbooks, of writings, of books that these people have produced, that feed the worldview, feed the ideology. So men arriving for the first time might not know about this history, but the men that they're coming into community with, who have been there for a long time, they know about it. And so what I think that this book demonstrates very powerfully is that even though might be a wave of men who are like, wow, this is all so cool and new and hip and interesting, there have been some old heads that are at it promoting really, really bad ideas for a really, really long time. And this book proves that. Real quick, before we jump into the last couple chapters, I've mentioned previously that I would like our next book of the study group to be Warrant for Genocide, the Myth of Jewish World Conspiracy and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see that book cover right there. This is a very old 1960s kind of yellow paged edition. It's quite old and it has that old book smell. These books are only available on eBay for $50 and up. Praise God, hallelujah. Christopher Cool, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right. He's going to be the guest on my podcast coming up next week. He pointed me to a website where you can get a copy of Warrant for Genocide, a brand new shiny copy for $20. Let me get that right now. Here it is right here. This is a brand new shiny copy of Warrant for Genocide, with a nice little flap and everything, updated and everything, with an introduction by, let's see who wrote the introduction here. The introduction is the Serif edition. A foreword doesn't say. Introduction to the Serif edition. It doesn't say who the author is. Let's just check real quick. And Norman Cohn. Okay, so this is Norman Cohn writing the introduction to his own book in 1995, 30 years after he wrote it. This is $20, so I'll put a link to this in the show notes if you want to read Warrant for Genocide. Far more accessible. Fun fact, this exact same copy of the book, I found it on eBay for $250. So someone's making some money on eBay. So I would like the next book to be Warrant for Genocide. But now here's something really important. Warrant for Genocide was written in 1967. In the late 1990s, additional material came out that goes into the writing of Warrant for Genocide, how it was ultimately forged and assembled, and who actually did the forging. So when the book was written, that information was not available. It was found in archival materials that only became available in the late 1990s. So in 2004, I have another book for you. The comic book artist Will Eisner wrote this book, The Plot, The Secret Story of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, with an introduction by Umberto Eco, actually, the famous author. So the plot, which you see right here, well, first of all, one of the very big benefits of it is it's a comic book, literally a comic book about the origins of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, including quotes from the protocols themselves and the whole story about how the protocols was fabricated with updated information that only became available in the late 90s for how it was written. So Warrant for Genocide is very, very good about the impact of the protocols, which is roughly the second half of the book. He traces very clearly, this is what happened once it was forged. He wrote with the most accurate information that he had available at the time about when it was forged and who forged it. But the plot has a much better information about the forging itself. So the plot doesn't go into what happened with the protocols after. In a very limited sense, it does. Of course, it talks about that. Warrant for Genocide is much better on that portion. And so by combining the plot to talk about the origins of the protocols and Warrant for Genocide to talk about the impact of them, I think we have a pretty good overview of what happens and how influential that evil document really is. And just real quick, I just want to stress, we are going to see the protocols of the Elders of Zion over and over and over again, especially in the conspiracy chapter. So just to talk a little bit more about the protocols and their impact, I think this is really important, which is why I'm diving into it. I have a third book that I can recommend. This book is called A Rumor About the Jews by Stephen Eric Bronner. The subtitle is Conspiracy, Anti-Semitism, and the Protocols of Zion. So this book is a little bit more about the history of anti-Semitism that fed into the worldview behind the writing of the protocols. So I'm not quite done with this book yet. I'm about 50 or so pages into it. So I'm really enjoying it. Apparently this book came out in the early 2000s and it was republished in 2015 in a second edition. And it was published in 2019 actually, in a second edition because it was so influential and so controversial when it came out. And so this is the first words of the preface. The Rumor About the Jews first appeared in 2000. St. Martin's Press published it in hardcover just before 9/11, and then went into paperback with Oxford University Press in 2003. So this was also published right around the same time as Black Sun, as a matter of fact, but then it was republished recently again in 2019 because the book proved to be so influential and so controversial in terms of the things that it talked about. So I'm looking forward to finishing this. One quick thing about this, Stephen Eric Bronner is, I believe he's a leftist. I believe he's a critical theorist, and he does not appear to be a fan of Christianity broadly. I'm not quite sure of his stance because again, I haven't really finished it, but it does show up. He does cite the Jesus Seminar in some of his discussions of the formulation of the New Testament. So, which I was disappointed to see because the Jesus Seminar is sort of a discredited kind of perspective on the formation of the New Testament. So he's got that wrong. But I'm not reading it for his perspective on the New Testament. I'm reading it for his perspective on anti-Semitism and the formative ideas behind what would eventually become the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So just to read through the table of contents of the book, just so you can sort of see what I'm talking about. Let's see, preface. Okay. Introduction 1, 2, Anti-Semitism for Popular Consumption. Selections from the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. 3, the text and context. The Protocols and the Varieties of Anti-Semitism, which is a very interesting kind of chapter about anti-Semitism being, quote unquote, a polyphonic hatred, meaning there's no one shape of it. It's interesting how he breaks that down. 4 is the tale of a forgery, inventing the protocols. 5, spreading the news, the protocols triumphant. 6, intermezzo, American populism and the Jews. I'm sure that's going to be very relevant. Maybe he'll say a few things about Donald Trump, I bet. 7, legacy of a lie, contemporary anti-Semitism and its future. So this is sort of what this book is about. I'm very interested in reading this. This is as we dig into more. Again, I had no intention of walking down this road. I really didn't. But because the protocol shows up in every single chapter of Black Sun, and I'm reading it over and over and over again, like I'm like, okay, I should probably understand more about this phenomenon, which led me to Warrant for Genocide, which led me to The Plot, which led me to a rumor about the Jews, which has also led me to another book, Anti-Semitism and Jew, an exploration of the etiology of hate by Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre. I had no idea that the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a book about anti-Semitism. According to what I've seen and heard about this book, it's quite short. It doesn't quite get the character of, and this is 1948, it doesn't quite get the character of Jews correct, which is probably why we don't know as much about it. But according to a lot of people who have read it, it gets the character of anti-Semites very correct. The kind of man or the kind of woman who becomes anti-Semitic, that is what this book is essentially about. What happens to their character? It says the anti-Semite turns himself to stone, which, we will see this again in Black Sun as we read through this. So I'm very interested to read this. And my friend Christopher Cool, who again, coming on the podcast next week, author of the book, Is God a Zionist? Which I think it's right up there on my bookshelf, but he gave me another book, William F. Buckley Jr., In Search of Anti-Semitism. This was apparently a famous book that was written, when was this written? They gave it to me in hardback, and this was written in 1992. So as far back as 1992, people were dealing with a particular, probably much more watered down compared to what we're seeing today, hatred of the Jews. And so I guess William F. Buckley Jr. wrote an article in National Review that was, according to this book anyway, was the most commented upon article he'd ever written specifically on this topic. So he decided to develop it into a book-length treatment. This was a gift from Christopher Cool. Christopher, I hope I'm saying your name right. This is a gift for Christopher Cool to me, and thank you so much for that. And so what's really funny is that as I'm reading through all of these books, I haven't started all of them yet, of course. As I'm reading through all of these books, I'm discovering that it's really difficult to get a sense of who Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were, who they actually were, how they understood themselves to be, because of all the layers of, we'll call it propaganda that have been spread about them. And I mean that in both a left-wing sense and a right-wing sense. The left-wing sense that, Hitler himself was Satan, and the right-wing sense that Hitler is a man to be admired and praised, and we're going to see that in Black Sun. I don't think left and right are accurate in those descriptions, by the way, but I'm just, they're the convenient words that I have to describe the phenomenon. So past Hollywood sensationalization, which we saw in the nasty Nazi Mysteries chapter, it's so hard to get a good look at them because everything is secondhand, and Hitler himself and the Nazis have become part of everyone's agenda in all these different ways. And so what's funny is that it's bringing me all the way back to the beginning of this journey, which was at this point 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, with the book Nazi Ecology by Dr. Mark Musser, who I had on my podcast. And in many ways, this book coming into my hands started me on the journey that has led me right today. And it's actually very, very interesting as we try and go back and understand what was actually going on then, because it seems very, very relevant that if people want to use the Nazis for their various political agendas or use history for their political agendas, whichever direction they want to use it in, it's probably good to go back and find out for ourselves. And so I just want to read you, and this is, again, you can see how many places I marked in this book. I just want to read you the description of this book. The Nazi Ecology, I had Dr. Mark Musser on my podcast mid to late 2024. I had him on after the Stone Choir incident. That was always the plan. I was always going to have him on after Stone Choir to facilitate a discussion about whether Hitler could be a Christian prince, because I had read this book and I knew there was no way that Hitler could be the Christian prince if this is if this is what the Nazis believed and what informed their worldview. So that was part of my intentions for doing that. Obviously, things didn't go according to plan. Praise God, now here I am today. So Nazi ecology deconstructs the anti-Semitic historical background of the early German Green movement of the 19th century that was absorbed by National Socialism. While many have decried the industrial nature of the Holocaust, such views cannot explain the motive behind the greatest crime of the 20th century. Nazi racism was foreshadowed by the social Darwinism of German Romanticism in the 1800s that laid the ecological foundations for what is otherwise known today as environmentalism. Nazi ecology explains why the Holocaust is best understood as a modernized form of human sacrifice carried out under biological/ecological camouflage that is rooted in the sacrificial oak imagery of ancient paganism. Now, I want you to keep that in your mind. Because as we get into Nordic Racial Paganism, the chapter that I'm literally about to start in right now, you're going to hear that is also how the Nazis understood themselves, and that is how Carl Jung, why he looked at he was a contemporary of the Nazis. He looked at it and he understood that that's what was going on, and he wrote as much to Miguel Serrano. Let that sink in. Right? In the early 1900s, we're talking 1930s, 1940s. It might have been the post-war era. Early 1900s and then into the post-war era, he was looking at the exact same thing that Mark Musser is saying. That's how he described what was going on inside Germany, and he wrote that, of all people, to Miguel Serrano. And if you've been listening to this series, that should hit you like a ton of bricks, and we are going to see it in just a minute. And so, I want to thank you for coming with me on this journey, because the purpose of this journey, there's been multiple different purposes of it. The purpose of it, first of all, is to show people a book that they're probably not going to read on their own. Not a lot of people are going to read this book. So if you're not going to read it, then I'll, as I've said many times, I'll read it to you. That's part one. Part two is I want people to understand that what they're looking at in the radical right, dissident right, extreme right, new Christian right, whatever, podcasters, Nick Fuentes, Ian Carroll, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, I want them to understand that while not everyone I've just named knows everything that I'm talking about in Black Sun, the worldview that they're espousing has been around for a long time and has carried forward in time to the point where these massive influential people can begin espousing it to millions. They did not come up with these ideas. These ideas were propagated long before then, right? Going back to two different things, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that's one stream, and going back to the Nazi anti-Christian, explicitly pagan beliefs, right? So there's two streams, as I talked about in the last. There's the colorful, fantastical, romantic, Volkish kind of ideas, and we're hearing the word Volkism a lot lately, especially in the Reform world. And we're going to get into that. We're going to get into that today. There's that face of it. And then underneath, there's the anti-Semitic, Jew-hating worldview that has religious, cultural, and political dimensions. And those two streams together feed into what we're seeing today. And they've gone viral to a massive, massive, massive degree. And the conspiracy chapter, which we're going to read, again, was published in 2002. And you're going to see that the conspiracy names that have been around for a long time, David Icke, Alex Jones is not mentioned, but he's been around for a while too. David Icke, Bill Cooper, those are two enormous names. Bill Cooper wrote a book, Behold a Pale Horse, hugely influential conspiracy book. I knew about that book. I first heard about that book in late 2000 when I met a buddy of mine. His name's Jason. He was the first person to show me that book the first time he and I met. So I heard about that book back in 2000. It was being widely read. And then David Icke, who's still around, and he talks about the protocols as well. So you have this kind of carrier wave of a conspiracy worldview about this cabal of elites, whatever you call them. And you'll see that, that some of the names I mentioned, like David Icke didn't believe that Jews was entirely accurate. He called them the elites or the Illuminati or whatever. But you have this carrier wave of this Manichaean light and dark worldview. Light is engaged in a death match with the dark. It's just objectively clear lines, right? You have that. And then you have, which is essentially pagan in its view. And then you have the anger and the outrage, and you have, a lot of this fury that's being expressed in this destructive kind of way that's kind of coming out of that, which is the rejection of Christ. And again, we're going to see the rejection of Christ, as we've seen throughout this whole book. Once you throw out biblical anthropology, biblical theology, biblical cosmology, you go fishing around to find something. You go fishing around to find something else, and it gets progressively more and more fantastical. And we're gonna see that again. And so, what I hope that I've made clear is that, again, none of this is new. None of it is new. It's been happening for a long time. There's nothing new. Literally, there is nothing new under the sun. And what people are calling new and edgy, and we're just waking up to all this for the first time. It's like, no, you're drinking very old poison. You're drinking very old poison that, was concocted long, long, long ago. When is arbitrary. But for the purposes of the story that we're telling right now, the protocols were concocted in the late 1800s in Russia, and that poison has spread around the world, and chapter after chapter, leads into a rejection of the Jews, which leads into a natural rejection of Christianity, which leads into a natural rejection of biblical anthropology, cosmology, and theology, which leads to, of all places, into Hinduism or into nature worship in the case of the Nazis. And then from there, all kinds of badness happens. All kinds of badness happens. And so that's, the big purpose of why I want to read this book, because, I don't expect that this book is going to change a lot of minds, but I want to help you see it. You, my listeners, you, my viewers, I want to help you see it so that you can speak into the lives of people who you love, who you know, who you care about, and let them know what's going on. And as I always say, or as is very popular to say in the Reform world, do the reading. So look, Black Sun, do the reading. 50 pages. First 50 pages, free on Amazon Kindle. Free. Download them. Download them on your phone. Read them. Then if you see anything you recognize in them, maybe buy the book and read it. Don't have to take my word for it. Don't have to take my word for it at all. None of this is new. So before we get started reading the book, lots to read this week. Just a reminder, my intention is to have the next edition of the book club be Warrant for Genocide, Myth of Jewish World Conspiracy and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Anyway, this is the edition. You'll find it linked in the show notes for $20. Praise God. And we're going to do this alongside the plot, The Secret Story of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So we'll do these two books together. Hopefully a printed textbook and a comic book is not too much for people to read, especially after Black Sun. So this is my intention, and then we'll go from there. All right, let's go. Black Sun. Again, I'm going to do a lot of reading this week. I know I say every week that I'm not going to do a lot of reading this time. I'm just being straight with you, and I'm going to do a lot of reading. So let's start on page 257 in this edition. If Christian identity remains the major religious expression of white Aryan racial identity in the United States, several new racial religions on the American far right simply reject the Christian heritage of the West altogether. Regarding Christianity itself as a Jewish cultural product with its origins in the Middle East, the Odinist movement articulates an unabashed racial paganism, invoking the gods of the Norse and Teutonic pantheons. By reviving the festivals, rituals, and customs of the ancient Indo-European peoples, they wish to break what they regard as the alien imposed dominion of Christianity after 2,000 years. This spiritual rediscovery of the Aryan ancestral gods is intended to embed the white races in a sacred worldview that supports their tribal feeling and partial view of humanity. Odinism today represents the battlefront of racist paganism in support of a white Aryan revolutionary path in the United States, with associated branches and chapters in Europe, South Africa, and Australia. Its devotees practice imaginative forms of ritual magic and ceremonial forms of fraternal fellowship based on Norse and Germanic models, while embracing the ideals of white supremacism and National Socialism. So the chapter from here is going to go and talk about three different figures. Wyatt Kaldenberg and his Pagan Revival Network, which focuses on Odin's warrior aspect and advocates the cult of violence. That's one. 2, Jost Turner and his NS kindred, which celebrates Odin as a master of mysteries and a devotional cult of Aryan mysticism with meditation and yoga, sort of syncretizing Aryan, sort of white racial Nordic pagan beliefs with New Age mysticism. Literally, it's literally what it is. It's actually really interesting to read about. And finally, the Wotansvolk movement of David and Katja Lane. That's the third group, with Ron McVan, which elaborates a full-blown Wotanist cult for the millenarian salvation of the endangered Aryan race. So 3 figures: Wyatt Kaldenberg, Jost Turner, and David and Katja Lane with Ron McVan. You may recognize the name David Lane, who wrote the 14 words, "We must secure a future for the white race and our children," or something like that. We'll get to it. That's David Lane. Died in prison, 150-year sentence. All right. So lots of reading. Continuing on page 257, the origins of Odinism as a self-conscious reconstruction of pre-Christian Teutonic beliefs lie in 19th century Germany. Against a background of burgeoning nationalism, Volkish writers, speculated on the Germans' spiritual resources in resisting Roman conquest and their recalcitrant conversion to Christianity under Charlemagne. In his widely read novel Ein Kampf Rom, which I think means My Struggle Against Rome, the historian Felix Dahn lauded the ancient Germans for their manly heroism, valor, and defiance, in contrast to Christian humility, repentance, and sense of sin. So that's going to come up over and over again. Manly heroism, valor, and defiance, in contrast to Christian humility, repentance, and sense of sin. This is a very, very important distinction. And the heart of man rebels against the notion that we must always examine ourselves to see if we're in the faith. The part about Christianity that so grates on a lot of these white racialists, and a lot of the Nietzschean Übermensch bros, is the idea of you should be skeptical of yourself. You should be skeptical of yourself and your motivations. Like the doctrine of original sin and total depravity, means that you should always be asking yourself questions, which stands in defiance of the man who says, "No, I am 1,000% self-certain, and I am going to go do this thing because I know that it's right in my own strength." Christianity runs right into that at the core of a man, and women too, but right into that in the core of a man. It might even be the clearest dividing line between whether someone truly wants to be in the faith or is driven by their own lusts, is that self-skepticism of recognizing there is no health in us, that I am the chief of sinners. That runs right into the Nietzschean Übermensch idea that, no, I am the source of all values, and I will do what I determine, and because I want it, it is right. It's either or. There's not a lot of compromise there, and so that can be very frustrating to a lot of men, and humbling in I think the best way, but they hate it, and you're going to see more of that. Continuing on page 258. Let's see. Otto Graf, a leader of the youth movement, this is in Germany, explain the role of ancient Germanic mythology in this new religiosity. Donar and Baldur, Lo and Fro are but names by which the Teutons signify the divine mystery he felt within himself. End quote. The ancient Germanic gods were no antiquarian constructs, but rather archetypes accessible to contemporary Germans who realized their true spiritual identity. The first issue of Nordungen declared, quote, Baldur Siegfried still lives today in the best of our people. His essence of sunlit liberation is alive in all of our longings and ambitions, and who would deny that Wotan, the eternal wanderer and Faustian seeker of experience, is still alive as once in Nordic man, end quote. So this is real. We're talking about 1911, 1924, right? These are the kind of this is the era that fed into Nazi Germany. Wotan, remember that name. Remember, that's going to come up again. So this idea that, well, maybe these aren't actual gods out there, but they're spirits that live within us. It's Wotan that lives within us. It's not Christ, you will notice. That's because they want to reject Christianity as a Jewish supremacist religion. They actually said that, and that's one of the things that I picked up from Nazi ecology, that the term Judeo-Christian has real meaning when you describe the different things that Judaism and Christianity bring to the table. Like, yes, of course, it's all God's story. It's all one big Christian story of redemption. But if you just had the Old Testament, you would see that these are gifts uniquely of the Jews, and they didn't come from the Greeks. They didn't come from the pagans, the notion of moral law. That is a very, very important thing, right? And then Christ completes the story. But they want to throw all that out. That is all Jewish. Jesus was a rabbi. We don't want to have nothing to do with any Jewish rabbis. We're going to go back to our Norse racial pagan ideas of pre-Christian Germany. But instead of saying these are real gods, we're going to psychologize them and make them elements of ourselves. That's what was going on leading up to Nazi Germany in the early 1900s. Continuing on page 258. The new Deutschglaube faith was elaborated by numerous writers, including Jacob Wilhelm Hauer, Bernhard Kummer, Alfred Kohn, and Adolf Kroll, who sought to define Germanic religion as an innate spirituality inherited from one's racial forebears, a living counterpart of the homeland, one's blood, feeling, and thinking. It was thus irreconcilable with the universalist claims of Christianity to absolute truth. Ding. However, German neo-paganism in the Weimar era usually recognized that a naive revival of the ancient Wotan cult was impossible for modern man. Pause. Yes, because, look, I've met a lot of these Norse pagan guys. Like, I just want to ask them, like, you're not really a polytheist. Give me a break. You're not really a polytheist. This is not 500, 600, 1,000 years ago or whatever. And so that's what he's saying is like the revival of the ancient Wotan cult. Polytheism is impossible for modern man. Continuing with Goodrich Clark, it rather sought a synthesis of German spirituality from the Norse sagas and the Icelandic Edda, together with the German mystical tradition and the idealist philosophy of Kant, Schelling, and Fichte. So Norse sagas, Icelandic Edda, philosophies of Kant, Schelling, and Fichte. And now here we go. Told you to bookmark the name Wotan. In his famous essay on Neo-Germanic spirituality, Carl Gustav Jung characterized this restless quest for a new Germanic spirituality as the eruption of the archetype, quote, Wotan, as a, quote, living and unfathomable tribal god, end quote. That's Jung, among the Germans after the First World War. This restless quest for a new Germanic spirituality as the eruption of the archetype Wotan as a living and unfathomable tribal god among the Germans after the First World War. So after the First World War, the archetype of Wotan erupted, that's the language that Goodrich Clark used, erupted out of the Germans after the First World War. An eruption of the archetype of Wotan, the Norse racial pagan god. Not an eruption of Christ. Not an eruption of Christ. Very important. That's Carl Jung looking at the Germans after the First World War. A return to the Wotanist cult, not Christianity. Not Christianity. That's Carl Jung. And this is why. Nazi Ecology by Dr. Mark Musser. Academic textbook. Took him 10 years to write. 10 years to write. I would like to read this again, perhaps just privately, not for the book club. But that's everything that Mark Musser is talking about. Continue, and then I will link my interview with him in the show notes. That was a very important moment for me. Okay, page 259. Odinism began its modern career with the establishment of the Odinist Fellowship in 1969 by Elsie Christensen. Elsie Christensen is a woman. Establishment of the Odinist Fellowship, Elsie Christensen. It's odd to me, for this hyper-masculinist world, just the influence of a couple women. Savitri Devi, Elsie Christensen. I could probably go through and find some others. These hyper-masculine dudes are like, oh yeah, the thing that I believe was started by a woman. I had a guy who was in the manosphere who's a big Ayn Rand fan. I was like, that's amazing, dude. Total pagan, hated Christ, big Ayn Rand fan. I liked the Fountainhead. I threw Atlas Shrugged across the room, actually. I was like, whatever, bro. We could talk about that separately. But, going hard against Christianity, it's like, dude, you get your worldview from a woman. What are you talking about? So I just want to note that. In 1951, the Christensens immigrated to Canada. This is page 259, where they settled in Toronto. Elsie Christensen's interest in racial radicalism brought her into contact with Willis Carto, a leading figure of the American far right, and James K. Warner, New York organizer of Rockwell's American Nazi Party. Carto introduced her to the writings of Francis Parker Yockey, who we're going to get to in just a minute, Oswald Spengler's American eulogist and author of Imperium. Abandoning the idea of using Odinism as the religious counterpart of National Socialism in America, James K. Warner, gave Christensen his Norse material, which included the writings of Alexander Rudd Mills. So Warner gave up on using Odinism as the counterpart of National Socialism in America. And so instead, they got Norse material. So here we go. Alexander Rudd Mills was an Australian lawyer and Nazi sympathizer who promoted a racial pagan religion within the context of the British Empire in the 1920s. In his most influential book, The Odinist Religion, Overcoming Jewish Christianity, 1930, Overcoming Jewish Christianity, he described how the Nordic races had built the civilizations of Sumeria, Egypt, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Amazing. Weakened by, quote, this is Mills, I believe, quote, foreign immigration and miscegenation, end quote. These racial paragons then absorbed the false Jewish Platonic idea of a transcendent God and eventually progressed to the Christian belief that all men were created equal. When you throw out biblical anthropology, bad stuff happens. Mills sought to restore the racial vigor of the pre-Christian English people through his Anglicized Church of Odin. So this was in Britain and England in the 1930s. Nordic races built the civilizations of Sumeria, Egypt, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Of course, bro. I just think this is funny. During the 1920s and 30s, Mills helped create small Odinic polygamist colonies in Australia, Great Britain, South Africa, and North America. But these pagan communes probably soon lapsed. Odinist polygamist colonies. Those aren't going to last very long. Mixing Odinism with occult and Masonic notions, Mills' writings remained his only tangible legacy, which Elsa and Alex Christensen, her husband, discovered in the early 1960s while immersing themselves in the writings of Yockey and Spengler. All right, here we go. Let's get into Francis Parker Yockey. Following Spengler, Yockey had argued that all cultures follow an organic pattern by passing through the successive phases of birth, growth, maturity, fulfillment, and death. Each culture has a soul that determines its religion, science, art, politics, and morality throughout its lifespan. Races are the raw material for cultural expression, differing in their degree of will to power. Anticipating the future fulfillment of Western culture in a powerful Eurasian imperium, Yockey expected to see the emergence of a robust white Western race. However, this outcome was presently frustrated by the spiritual malaise of the West, which Yockey elaborated as the pathologies of culture parasitism, culture distortion, and culture retardation. Culture parasitism denotes the presence of alien groups that cannot participate in the historical destiny of a culture. Yockey believed that Black and Asian peoples in the West replace an unborn indigenous white population, thus depriving the Western culture of proper raw material for the fulfillment of its destiny. Yockey saw the Jews as the most dangerous form of parasitism in the West, namely culture distortion, when, quote, this is Yockey now, quote, outer life forms are warping the culture from its true life path, end quote. During the Middle Ages, the Jews had remained secluded in their ghettos, an inert organism outside the mainstream of Western development. But once Western culture reached its maturity in the age of rationalism around 1750, the Jews sensed their opportunity. That's what Goodr Clark, how he characterizes Yockey's writing. With their distorting ideas of materialism, economics, and usury, in opposition to absolutism, they undermined the spirit and traditional elites of the West. Seeking their own advantage and emancipation, they furthered democracy, equality, feminism, capitalism, and socialism during the 19th century. As a colony of Western culture, America had been especially vulnerable to this influence, which was exacerbated by high levels of Jewish immigration from the 1880s onward. Succumbing to this culture distortion, America was subverted from its historical destiny and was induced to intervene in Europe when Hitler initiated the first phase of the new authoritarian imperium. Pause. So what Yockey is saying is that each culture has its own destiny. The white culture, Western culture, has its own destiny, but it's currently being drained of its vitality by parasitism. right? By Black and Asian parasitism, Black and Asian peoples, right? So it's redirecting the white race from its natural growth curve, right? Parasitism. But the Jews are the chief parasite who emerged from seclusion in the 1750s to distort and warp white Western culture. They sensed their opportunity, and they brought in, democracy, equality, feminism, capitalism, and socialism. If you were to actually trace the origins of these ideas, you would not find that. You would not find that. By the way, this is pure Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So that's exactly what this is. But America had high levels of Jewish immigration from the 1880s. And this is culture distortion, culture pollution. And then America was subverted from its historical destiny. America could have been a great nation, but it was induced to intervene in Europe when Hitler initiated the first phase of the new authoritarian imperium. So what Yahweh is saying is that Hitler was trying to put the West back on its path, this white racial utopian paradise. But America was induced to intervene in World War II by the Jews, right? And so subverted America's historical destiny. Entirely ahistorical. Like, is it really the Jews that got America involved in World War II? Like, does that history actually bear out? It doesn't, actually. It really doesn't. Okay, continuing. So this is, again, that Hitler was the last hope for the white race, but the Jews manipulated America to get us to enter into the war. And I might add, this is exactly what the dissident right, new Christian right, whatever these guys are, extreme right, loony, jumping off the cliff, loony wing, is saying is that America is doing in Iran, that Israel is manipulating America to invade Iran. I ain't dying for Israel is what these guys say. Why? And this is why you see Alexander Dugin saying that Iran is the last hope or something like that. He tweeted the other day. Why? Because radical Islam, right? They are the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Radical Islam is the enemy of the Jews. So therefore, for these radical right guys, radical Islam is my friend because they hate the Jews also. Same thing. Exactly the same thing. And if you don't believe me on that, later in this chapter, we're going to see the same thing that was said about Iraq. You're going to in the 1990s. You're going to see that in just a minute. So this idea that the Jews are executing this global world conspiracy that is manipulating America for Jewish ends, Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That is what it is. That is what it is. And you have this Manichaean light and dark. White people are everything that's good, and the Jews are everything that's evil. And all of history is the Jews in various forms subverting, as the Manichaean pure expression of evil at the deepest level, subverting the path of the virtuous white Christian man. That's what it is. That's what it is. And shout out to Doug Wilson in one of his recent videos. He said that story makes white people the dupes of history. We are constantly the Washington Generals up against the dastardly, he didn't say this, the dastardly Harlem Globetrotters, of the game, or Lucy pulling the football away from Linus. That's one of the reasons he rejects the story, because that's exactly what it makes white people. White people are so ineffective, that they can't execute their own destiny without constantly being subverted by the Jews. And if that's the case, if Jews are waging total war on white people, then white people are legitimized in waging total war back on Jews. That's where the ideology leads, because it's in the case of war, everything's on the table. They're waging total warfare on white men, so white men should wage total warfare back, and everything is on the table, including extinction, Holocaust, and genocide. That is what we are seeing. And again, not new. Continuing on. Page 260, Yahweh saw the defeat of the Axis as a terrible lost opportunity for Western revival. Writing in 1948, he noted, quote, that a deep yearning is going through the Western world to be free from the dirt and uncleanness of party politics, class war, financial usury, and the complete absence of the heroic spirit. End quote. That's Yaki. The future state form, he was certain, this is Goodrick Clark, was the resurgence of authority. Honor, religion, and a stern socialism will sweep away the distortions of democracy, money power, and finance capitalism. This new racial state will undertake a massive war for the survival of Western civilization, while its, quote, this is Yaki, new total political organizatory authoritarian imperialism will plant the Western banner on the highest peaks and the most remote peninsulas, end quote. That's Yaki. New total political organizatory authoritarian imperialism. White authoritarian imperialism. That's Francis Parker Yaki. And someone in the Reform and Christian world recently retweeted a quote of Francis Parker Yaki that was circulating on X. I would like to name this person, but I can't confirm it 100%. If I can, I invite you to come over to the YouTube video, and if I can find it, then I will put it on the screen. I'll put it on the screen for you so you can see for yourself who it is. I don't want to call anyone out and get their names wrong, but I was shocked to find out who retweeted it. And so again, a lot of guys might not know who Francis Parker Yaki is. Some guys in this world do, and they ain't saying. These ideas are not new. All right, 261. Elsie Christensen's ideas for an Odinist revival of Aryan culture were directly inspired by her reading of Yaki, Mills, and Jungian psychology. She agreed with Yaki that Western civilization was in a late degenerate phase, undermined by Christianity, capitalism, and communism. Oh wow, that's actually exactly what the Nazis believed. Like, as in the National Socialist, that is exactly what they believed. Jewish communism from the East, Jewish capitalism from the West, and Jewish Christianity from within. It's exactly what the Nazis believed. Noting Yaki's emphasis that, quote, this is Yaki, disease to a culture can only be a spiritual phenomenon, end quote, quoting Yaki. She believed that only a religious antidote could arrest and reverse the current decline of the Aryan West. The remedy lay in Mill's revival of Norse paganism as the primordial expression of the Aryan folk soul. Quote, this is Christensen, the role of Odinism is clear. The pathogens must be destroyed, and healthy organisms raised to serve the purposes of Aryan spiritual liberation and all-around advancement, end quote. Christensen identified the seeds of an Aryan cultural revival in, quote, the subconscious elements of Urd, end quote, whatever that is, URD, interpreted in Jungian terms as the genetic transition of the collective unconscious. By plumbing the archetypes of the racial unconscious, white people could discover their ancestral wisdom. Race and religion are thus organically related. The source of Odinism is thus biological, end quote. This is Christensen. Its principles are encoded in our genes. Odinism embodies the reality of multifaceted struggle to defeat our enemies and fulfill our destiny, end quote. Again, we need to reject Christianity because we need to reject Judaism, and we need to find instead Odinism, Nordic pagan racial religion informed by pre-Christian Germany. And these are not gods out there in the ether. These are archetypes within us. That is what she's saying. So it's a psychological, quasi-spiritual, anti-Christian, anti-Christ, and anti-Semitic vision of white racial renewal, not in gods out there, but archetypes in here. That's what she's talking about. Her politics were left of center, which is pretty funny, actually. It says that later. And then page 261, while Christensen was advancing her racial Odinism in the 1970s, the alternative movement of Asatru, more concerned with the practice of rituals and Norse magic, was started by Steve McNallen in Texas. Asatru is an Icelandic word meaning belief in the Aesir, or gods. Their memberships often overlap, but by the end of the 1970s, the political divide between Odinism and McNallen's Asatru Free Assembly had become acute. Asatru is A-S-A-T-R-U. The presence of racists and Nazis, this is interesting, this is within Asatru, was an embarrassment to McNallen and other AFA members, the Asatru Free Assembly, whose racial pride was secondary to an exploration of spirituality. Skipping ahead, McNallen's attempt, this is very interesting, McNallen's attempt to weed out Nazis from the AFA led to more radical initiatives in the Odinist movement. Among those who left were Jost Turner, who we're going to get to, whose NS kindred is the subject of later discussion. Other former ASA Aryanists, Siggy Hubbards, Tom Paget, Wyatt Kaldenberg, and others built the Greater Los Angeles area chapter of the Odinist Fellowship. Tom Paget invited Tom Metzger, a notorious white racist then leading the White American Political Association, to speak at the chapter's Folk Moot, or meeting, after which Metzger was a frequent guest at Odinist meetings. However, Elsie Christensen thought Metzger too racist, and members of the Arizona kindred also wanted the fellowship to be pro-white, but not hostile to colored races and Jews. With Christensen urging restraint and a low profile, racist Odinists within the Los Angeles chapter wanted less ambiguous allies. Redbeard formed the racialists Thor's Hammer kindred. Elton Hall broke with the Arizona kindred and formed the Jomsviking kindred. Tom Paget and Wyatt Kaldenberg joined Metzger's newly formed White Aryan Resistance. Wyatt Kaldenberg became editor of Metzger's periodical WAR, or War, and promoted Odinism through his articles. So as a result of Steve McNallen, who started the Asatru Free Assembly, AFA, wanting to weed out racists and Nazis, these groups shattered and splintered into 1,000 different pieces, and one can only imagine the effeminate girl drama as all these guys are arguing about who's more pagan than the next guy. But this is the common pattern. This is the common pattern. As soon as someone takes a stand, as soon as someone influential in a position of power takes a stand and roots out all of the evil and is willing to do that, yes, your movement may shatter. Your movement may shatter. But how are you going to preserve your soul? Now, in these guys' cases, they're talking about paganism, so they can only get so far with that. But if you want to be a person of principle and you're like, look, we don't want any of this around our club, get out. Like, yeah, let all the girl drama happen. But it needs to happen. And too few men have the courage of a pagan like Steve McNallen and say our spiritual pursuits are more important than our ethnic identity. They're more important. And amen, hallelujah to that. They're wrong in their spiritual pursuits, of course, but they understand that there's something higher, calling people higher. And they weren't willing to make it a racial thing. And so kaboom, all of their movements splintered. And the more radical elements got to go hang out with themselves. And I really wish that more men would take a stand like Steve McNallen did. I really, really wish they would. A lot would change. So page 263, talking about Wyatt Kaldenberg. His pagan worldview is essentially Manichaean, seeing history and politics as a cosmic battle between the divine Aryans and demonic unnatural forces of Judeo-Christianity. Manichaean, light and dark, locked in an eternal struggle, yin and yang, essentially. Yin and yang, that is ultimately about all things are one, but you can see there's a light and the dark, and they are forever, locked in a pattern together. So the divine Aryans are the good guys, and demonic unnatural forces of Judeo-Christianity are the bad guys. The Aryans once lived in harmony with nature and a golden age prevailed, but Judeo-Christianity plunged the world into a dark age. The Aryan race is identified with the earth, life, and nature, while the mud races are, quote, death, the decay of winter, and the maggots which feed on life. That's Kaldenberg, end quote. The Aryans must defeat this darkness, otherwise winter will reign for an eternity. Sounds a little bit like a Song of Ice and Fire, doesn't it? It sounds a little bit like that. I'm not saying that, George Martin was talking about that. It's just an odd parallel. All right. This is really important. Wyatt Kaldenberg's, this is page 263, his own vicious tirades and macho language in articles and published letters are clearly targeted at alienated youth seeking a straightforward justification for violent acts against Jews and colored people. Let me read that again. Wyatt Kaldenberg's own vicious tirades and macho language in articles and published letters are clearly targeted at alienated youth seeking a straightforward justification for violent acts against Jews and colored people. That is what this is about. That is exactly what this is about. We want justification. We want the consent of our conscience to commit targeted acts of persecution and violence. And the way that we get there is a belief that war is being waged against us by forces of ultimate evil. That's how we get there. We are the poor, persecuted white guys. We're just all sunshine and light, and the Jews are demonic evil waging total war against us. Therefore, we have the right to wage total war against them. Targeted acts of persecution. The consistent belief of all of these groups, through Black Sun and into Warrant for Genocide also a little bit, the consistent belief of all of these groups is we as this ultimately pure brotherhood. If we strike out, we will be the kindling that ignites the fire of the revolution. We will be the ones. We are going to target this synagogue, this mosque, right? Or this whatever, like, because it shows up in multiple contexts, because Muslims believe this too. This was the whole thing with 10/7. The Palestinian Muslims in Gaza, they believe that if they just started the attack on Israel, that all of the other Muslim nations around would follow suit. And that's not what happened. Same here. If we, as this group of brothers, if we just strike back against the Judeo-Christian elite, then all the other brothers around us will rise up and the revolution will begin. That is the Turner Diaries. That's exactly what it is. The thing is, that never happens. It never happens. So what ends up happening? They get shot, destroyed, murdered, imprisoned, right? It is a really good trick that Satan uses to draw people away and destroy them. You are going to be the one that starts the revolution. Just pull the trigger, and you're going to be the guy. You're going to start the global revolution. It's here. And then, sorry, as C.S. Lewis says, Satan breaks his tools. Devil breaks his tools. That's what this is about. Okay. Quote, Kaldenberg. This is now Kaldenberg. We must kill all who threaten our survival. We must crush dissent. Mass murder is a sad thing, but nature dealt the white race a raw hand. If we do not remove the dark ones from our land, then sooner or later all white nations will end up as dark as India. End quote. That's Kaldenberg. Someone take that quote, post it on X, and find out how many people agree with that, and then tell them who it is. Continuing, Woodrow Clark. Kaldenberg castigates Christianity for renouncing aggression, violence, and conquest. As an alien Jewish import, Christianity has emasculated the pagan Aryan peoples by alienating them from the vital forces of their own gods and goddesses. Quote, now this is Kaldenberg. White people are so effed up that we have demonized, and he wrote out the whole word, are so effed up that we have demonized our native belief system and glorified the fables and mythology of foreigners. The deranged rants of the termite Jesus devour the structures of our inner self. Christianity is the theology of self-hating. What did I say just a minute ago? This is why the Nietzschean heart of man hates Christianity, devours the structures of our inner self. This self-certainty that these men require, Christianity demands that they lay it at the foot of the cross, that they doubt themselves, that they doubt their heart. Their heart is deceitfully wicked. Who can know it? That's what Christianity demands of your perspective on yourself as a man. That the only truth can be known from God and from Christ. Men hate that because they want to be the ones who decide good and evil for themselves. Devours the structure of our inner self. Christianity is the theology of self-hating. That's not true. Of course it's not true. But for men who want to be completely self-satisfied and dependent on their own minds and hearts for their worldview, it seems like that. Continuing on, Kaldenberg. Praise Jesus and his cult of universal brotherhood. Thanks to Jesus, soon we won't even have a white race. End quote. Kaldenberg. That's his quote. And you can find that on X every day. You can find that stuff in the comment threads of a lot of guys, who call themselves Christians, and a lot of guys who don't. You see that exact idea. Hitler hated Christ. Shout out to my bro. He documents this stuff all the time. All the time. It is everywhere. It's everywhere. And ultimately, if you as a man decide that you want to do things your way and not God's way, you're forced into a very uncomfortable position. Especially if you built a brand on calling yourself a Christian. How are you going to walk both those roads when it's becoming increasingly obvious that you're not doing good things God's way? You're doing them your own way. How are you going to walk that road? A lot of guys are on that road, and they're faking it and they're LARPing so bad as they're walking away from the faith, and not enough good men are calling them out. Just true. That's just true. So, that is what it is. And that's why I'm doing this. So you don't have to take my word for it. You can read a book for yourself. All right. Continuing, this is Goodrick Clark. He blames the Jews for Christianity, which has killed off 300 million European pagans over 2,000 years. Faced with such an enemy, he has little use for Holocaust denial and asks, this is Kaldenberg now, quote, why we didn't grease the Jews sooner, end quote. The Holocaust should rather be celebrated, quote. This is Kaldenberg again. Auschwitz and Dachau should be religious shrines because evil died there, end quote. And I give the guy a penny for his consistency. Holocaust is good that it happened. It should have happened. I don't agree with him, obviously, but I respect him being consistent. No, Holocaust, it didn't happen, but it'd be good if it did. It's like, no, you should just be happy that it happened. right? If you were really being consistent in your worldview, but they want to have it both ways. They want to say, no, it didn't happen, but kind of wish it would. It's like, well, if I show you evidence that it did happen, are you going to be like, yeah, good, own that. I just want men to own it in the sunlight. I really just want that. It is that easy. And, for everything else he was, at least Kaldenberg had the courage of his convictions. Continuing 264. Despite the left-wing inspiration of his youth, Kaldenberg despairs of the majority, even of whites. His ideal society is structured on an ancient Viking meritocracy with a ruling caste of jarls or warriors, quote, with the courage to fight and die to defend the Volk, end quote. That's Kaldenberg. From their ranks, all royalty and aristocracy were selected so that, quote, the greatest Aryan men and women had the freedom to excel to the top of society, end quote. Also Kaldenberg. The middle caste were the carls or workers who did not fight but were the silent majority of their day, quote, the mindless white sheep herd, end quote. Beneath them were the thralls, a criminal slave caste. Kaldenberg's Aryan revolution has no time for folksy egalitarian moots. Power must be concentrated in the hands of the aristocratic warrior elite. Quote, Kaldenberg, our principal adversary in the battle for white survival is the white majority. Only the rule by a tribal council made up of the best, most active, and most devoted will free the sheep from the tyranny of themselves. The masses will always be sheep, waiting to be exploited by someone. The white sheep herd were born to serve the illuminated ones. End quote. Illuminated ones is capitalized. So Kaldenberg is at least consistent with his worldview. Might makes right, and we will be the mightiest even within our own race. I don't know. I give the guy credit for running it all the way out. He ran it all the way out. He didn't just say all white people are good. He's like, nope. There are some elite whites who will rule over the rest. That is ultimately where the worldview leads. Which, of course, it sounds really cool until if you think you're the biggest, baddest dude, but guess what? At some point, you are going to age, you will lose a step, and you will not be the biggest, baddest dude. You won't even live to be an old man within that worldview. Someone else will come along, and he will kill you and take your stuff. And when you are being defeated by the superior warrior, what do these guys say? They don't say, the triumph of my worldview, the strongest has survived. They complain. I was cheated. You did something wrong. It's like, no, if might makes right, you should celebrate being destroyed by someone mightier than you. But it's not ultimately about might makes right. It's about me being right. And so that's where that worldview ends. Continuing on 264. Kaldenberg's vehement rejection of Judeo-Christianity on political and sexual grounds leads to the celebration of Odinism chiefly as a cult of aristocracy, power, and the propagation of the white race. As, quote, Kaldenberg, the pagan law of tooth and claw made our race great, end quote. Kaldenberg directs most of his polemic against the liberal, cowardly, and pusillanimous whites who are not prepared to work to fight for space and win suitable Aryan mates for the multiplication of their race. His rails against Christian identity for fatally misdirecting the energies of Aryan revival toward a false Jewish cult. However, given the armed superiority of the established authorities, he discourages the millennial insurrection of the Turner Diaries as a suicide mission. More recently, he has endorsed the idea that Aryan revolutionaries should form new corporatist elite, suggesting that Odinists take up capitalism, invest in the stock market, and thus control the means that control the masses. Quote, Kaldenberg, whoever controls the blue chip companies controls America. Who controls America controls Europe, NATO, and the United Nations. Who controls the United Nations controls the earth. End quote, Kaldenberg. Ultimately, only power and numbers count for Kaldenberg. And again, this might be the smartest guy that we've heard about in this entire book. He gets it. Like, he's wrong, obviously, but he's pushed it all into the corners. And he truly has thought through the implications. He understands that it would be a suicide mission. So if we're really serious about taking control, let's meritocratically win the game in front of us. And then we'll do our white racialist imperium. Let's not do a suicide mission, Satan drawing people out to destroy them. You're going to be the ones who start the revolution. Trust me, bro. Let's not do that. What did I just say? I said that 5 pages earlier. The Turner Diaries, that's what it's about. You're going to be the ones to start the revolution. Trust me, bro. And then they're destroyed. He saw that, and he understands that we need to build up our community economically to have influence and power. Like, I don't know. The dude's totally wrong. Like, he's not sitting in the right direction either, but he's thought it through. His macho posturing, at least like understands the trajectory of his own ideas. And I have a bit of respect for that because a lot of other guys don't seem to get that. Continuing with Jost Turner, page 264. Jost Turner was a communal Odinist pioneer and also articulated a racialist Odinism that places great emphasis on spirituality and consciousness raising. According to Matthias Gardell, he established his National Socialist kindred during the 1980s on a folkish back to the land Odinist commune called Volksburg in the mountains of Northern California. In his teaching known as Aryan Kriya, brace yourself, Jost combines Aryo-Vedic beliefs, Norse mythology, and Hindu Tantrism to direct the spiritual evolution of the Aryan individual in accordance with racial archetypes. Hindu Tantrism, Aryo-Vedic beliefs, and Norse mythology. What happens when you reject biblical theology, cosmology, and anthropology? You end up in Hinduism. And that's exactly where Jost Turner ended up. That's exactly where he ended up. Happens over and over again. You end up in Norse racial paganism, or you end up in Hinduism. But because Norse paganism, the Norse civilization is younger than Hinduism, they go to Hinduism, which is older, as if older means true, right? That's the wonderful thing. That's the wonderful thing about Christianity and Judaism is just because something's older than Judaism doesn't make it true. You deal with that online all the time. God entered into history to give his law at a particular moment in time, but that doesn't mean that everything was right before then. It was just that was the moment that God chose to intervene. So Jost Turner, born in 1946, served in Vietnam, 101st Airborne. Embittered and traumatized, he returned to his native California in 1967 and began exploring occultism and Oriental religions at the height of the Flower Power era. At this time, he encountered the autobiography of a yogi by Swami Paramahansa Yogananda, an Indian who had led a Hindu mission to the United States during the 1920s. Jost trained in Kriya Yoga with Yogananda's Self-Realization Fellowship and lived for 2 years in an ashram in Northern California. By the mid-1970s, Jost became interested in Norse paganism and occult National Socialism and was involved with the Asatru Free Fellowship. He married Stephen McNallen's sister, and the families remained close even after Jost left the AFA. So he goes to Vietnam, comes back, he serves with reconnaissance in the 101st Airborne, comes back embittered and traumatized, explores occultism and Oriental religions. These two go hand in hand. They're opposite sides of the same coin. In the height of the Flower Power era, 1967. Then he reads Autobiography of a Yogi. And then he goes into Self-Realization Fellowship and lives in an ashram. And then he becomes involved in Norse paganism and occult National Socialism. So through Eastern mysticism, he ends up in the occult, which leads him to National Socialism and becomes involved with the Asatru Free Fellowship. Continuing, 265, Jost sympathized with the hippies' ideas of dropping out and destroying the system by non-participation. When hippies began to form self-sufficient communes in the country, Jost was impressed by their mastery of homesteading, animal husbandry, and craft skills. Deciding to break with urban society, Jost and his family coined the commune movement and joined the commune movement, and learned these same skills. The hippie communes embraced an idealism based on left-wing solidarity, Oriental religion, and a tolerance for drugs. Jost regarded their lack of discipline and the rise of marijuana cultivation with its easy profits as the chief factors that eventually destroyed both the ideals and the community spirit. Once the former utopianism embraced a readiness for armed resistance to outside interference, a defensive attitude led to an alliance between armed hippie cultivators and right-wing revolutionaries. So once the left-wing guys started raising marijuana to fund their communes, they decided they were both going to join hands with right-wing revolutionaries to be buddies because we both have an enemy in the system for different reasons, right? It's very interesting. And this is Jost Turner. In this world of outlaw rural enclaves, Jost saw the seeds of a back-to-the-land movement for racially conscious whites. This is a quote from Jost Turner. Today, the mountains are waiting for a new back-to-the-land movement, one imbued with a true idealism and a sound spiritual philosophy. This time, it will not be the pressures of white middle-class materialism that will spur a back-to-the-land movement. This time, it will be the awesome pressure of mass non-white immigration and white second-class citizenship. How much more useful would it be to put their energy... It pains me to see our youth, let me back up for a second. It pains me to see our youth in government prisons for smashing a few degenerate heads in a futile attempt to fight back against overwhelming oppression. How much more useful it would be to put their energy into huming themselves a homestead and ultimately an Aryan community out of the unsettled mountains. Why not take up the old hippie slogan to drop out and begin by destroying this anti-white system by non-participation, end quote. Jost believed that new Aryan folk communities are the bridges to a more highly evolved species of Aryan mankind. Only these Übermenschen, what I've been saying, Nietzsche, Übermenschen, Supermen, could lead the world back into harmony with nature and toward a golden age envisioned by Adolf Hitler. Ugh. In this way, Jost thought elaborated Elsie Christians' idea of the awakening archetypes to include New Age notions taken from yoga and Hinduism, fusing National Socialism, yoga, and Hinduism. Over and over again, we see this. Deeply anti-Christian worldviews. Right? When you throw out the Jews, a lot's got to go with it. You know, you throw out the Jews, you throw out Genesis 1. You throw out Genesis 1 and 2. Once you throw out, you lose a biblical anthropology, right? And once you lose, and cosmology, and once you lose that, you go fishing. And what do you find? Poison. Eels, electric eels, or various other scary creatures. Inspired by Savitri Devi's devotional work, The Lightning in the Sun, Jost regarded Hitler as a semi-divine religious leader who had indicated the Aryan spiritual future in the higher collective of the folk. Like Savitri Devi, Jost also embraced Hitler as an evangelist of love. This is Jost Turner, quote, "His words, his actions, his entire existence is testimony to his selfless love of his folk. Everything that he did was done for the benefit of the folk. The welfare and higher evolution of the folk is the only reason for the existence of National Socialism." End quote. That's Jost Turner. Jost's eulogies of National Socialism as a selfless religion could easily be describing an idealized form of Christianity or Hindu Vedanta. He attributed the failure of National Socialism to the selfishness and materialism of the unregenerate Aryans rather than the Jews, and regarded Hitler as a martyr whose sacrifice to these negative forces should awaken the Aryans to their real destiny. Once the Aryan discovers true love, he clearly sees that the enemy images of colored races, international finance, and the Jews are quote, this is Turner, all just symptoms of a deadly disease of selfishness, end quote. This equation of National Socialism with a religion of selflessness shows just how far Jost had managed to combine his Odinism with the teachings of Yogananda. There is no other, we're all only one. So it's kind of funny that he goes in through the door of Odinism, this white racial paganism, and just ends up in all is one. And like, at least he takes it, in a more positive direction and not a Manichaean direction. Manichaean would be light and dark or engaged in a cosmic struggle. All is one would say that ultimately there are no distinctions. We're all one, bro. And so Jost Turner, while perhaps his surface coating was Nordic racial paganism, right within that he was ultimately Hindu. And we're going to see that right now. 267, Jost Turner's system of Aryan spiritual self-development was based on the Tantric Hinduism of Yogananda, Norse mythology, and the Hindu Nordic ideas of Savitri Devi and Miguel Serrano, whose ideas had begun to spread into the pagan subculture by the early 1990s. Jost claimed that Yogananda's autobiography and ideas had been edited by disciples to gain acceptance in liberal America. Jost declared that Yogananda was not anti-Hitler and supported the non-interventionist America First movement during the Second World War. After reading Savitri Devi's account of Aryan Hinduism, Jost was convinced that Kriya sprang from kindred blood, meaning like he read about Savitri Devi and he's like, oh, this is clearly a white guy thing. Kriya yoga, clearly it's a white guy thing. Its teaching reflected Odinism, while its quote, this is Turner, path of accelerated evolution, spiritual evolution, was what was symbolized by the allegories of Wotan, Thor, and Yggdrasil. I don't know how to say that word, but Yggdrasil, Yggdrasil, end quote, Turner. Oh man, I got to read this. All right. Gardell, this is Goodrick Clark references Gardell, who wrote another book. And so he's consciously referencing, I got this material from Gardell, who gave it to me. Gardell writes that Jost pursued the story of Yogananda's own guru, Babaji Nagaraj, a supposedly immortal Aryan Siddha, Siddha, self-realized divine being. Legend records that Nagaraj, quotes, king of the serpents, signifying mastery of Kundalini, was born in AD 230. Practicing Kundalini yoga, he achieved the highest state of human evolution, physical immortality, and divine enlightenment at the age of 16. Supposedly still alive today, Nagaraj leads an ashram of fellow immortals in the Himalayas. According to Jost, this ashram was a secret center sought by Miguel Serrano during his years in India. Many gurus besides Yogananda claim to have been sent by Nagaraj to teach mankind the consciousness-raising techniques of Kriya Yoga. Through his own practice of Kriya, Jost came to feel that Nagaraj was now directing him to take up the struggle against the forces of the Dark Age, or Kali Yuga. Again, there's the Kali Yuga. After receiving instruction in the original 144 Kriyas or practices by another American disciple of Nagaraj, Jost was told to open an Aryan path, quote, this is Turner, for Aryanists, Odinists, National Socialists, and other true heirs to the ancient Aryan science of accelerated evolution, end quote. So he's saying that, he's like, oh yeah, Babaji, Yogananda's guru, is passing on teachings that I now need to pass along to white people. The devil's loving this. It's like, oh yeah, bro, totally. Babaji was the guy. And I'm going to give this, and you need to give all these teachings to these white guys too. It totally goes with Norse racial paganism, bro. Absolutely 100%. Here you go. It's incredible, man. It's incredible. And I know of Babaji and Yogananda because when I was in India in 2019, I read the autobiography of a yogi. I was not planning on going to the Kumbh Mela festival, but a lot of people in India told me I should. And then I read autobiography of a yogi, and I read it. I was like, well, I'm in India. The Kumbh Mela festival, which plays a major role in the narrative of Yogananda's story, is happening. I need to go. And because at the festival is where Babaji allegedly appeared to Yogananda. And so sent Yogananda on his journey. And there's a Bodhi tree. There's a tree. It's a banyan tree, I think, that is supposedly the tree where Babaji appeared. And there's a photo of me. If I can remember, I'll put it, I'll show it right now on the screen, sitting at the tree that Babaji allegedly appeared at. So I'm familiar with all of this. And I stayed in a self-realization fellowship ashram when I was at the festival. That's another important point. I read Yogananda's book. I reached out to SRF. I became a member of SRF temporarily so that I could go attend the festival, paid some dues, got free food and, a tent to sleep in on the floor with 40 or 50 other guys basically. And had a wonderful time at the festival, inspired by autobiography of a yogi. So again, I wasn't Christian at the time. I was looking for God, as I've said many times. And so I know exactly what he's talking about. And the idea that he's trying to syncretize this with Norse racial paganism is like, bro, I've been to India. Whatever you think the Aryans are, you got to get up on a plane and go to India and try and figure out how you're going to synthesize those two, because that synthesis exists only in your own mind. And then just going back to the book, Jost understood history in terms of the Hindu Puranic divisions of time, but his system was more complex, involving two interacting cycles. This is going back to Julius Evola, the Kali Yuga. It's going back to that. It's a modification of that. 268 Aryan Kriya is based on the precepts of classical yoga, involving a set of moral requirements to purify body and mind through correct body posture, asanas, and meditation. So they were doing Nazi yoga, white supremacist yoga. I'm sorry. Like at some point you have to imagine, like someone actually commented, I think it was in one of the earlier YouTube videos, bro, I had this vision of Nazis doing yoga. Like, whoever you are, if you're listening to this, you were right. Congratulations. You win a prize. However, Jost, this is continuing back to the book, Jost differs from Patanjali and most yoga teachers by claiming that celibacy is a Christianized distortion of true Aryan Kriya during the Dark Age. Ahimsa, truthfulness, nonviolence, has also been wrongly interpreted to mean no one should harm a living creature. Jost claims that one must be prepared to take up arms in a revolutionary war against the oppressors. In the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita, here comes Jost Turner, quote, "We may be compelled by duty to harm or kill, but it is important that our mind be kept clear of hatred, animosity, and any desire for revenge." End quote, Turner. So, we might be called to defend our people, but you have to do it lovingly. You have to wage total war, but wage it lovingly. The heart is deceitfully wicked. How can you know that's actually what's going on? Christianity says. And so we hear Wyatt Kaldenberg in the background being like, I told you so. Man, this is so crazy, dude. The regime of Aryan Kriya involves daily baths, a macrobiotic diet, and a rural lifestyle in harmony with nature. The Aryans should practice various yoga techniques that recall Miguel Serrano's Hindu-Aryan yoga of swastika spinning chakras. Seated in the swastika posture, swastikasana, which I didn't know existed, the adept can rouse the kundalini energy at the base of the spine and circulate it through the chakras by concentrating on images of the runes of the swastika and by chanting mantras like Om for the sixth chakra, called the Eye of Wotan. That's here. That's the third eye. The third eye is not the Hindu one. Now it's the Eye of Wotan. Like, honestly, man, like, we can look at I look at this and laugh, and because it is kind of funny from having come in a particular side of that world, but these guys took it very seriously. And you see just how wrong people can go when they throw out Christianity, when it's got to be my way, and I can't stand the Jews, and I don't like the moral teachings of Christians in Christ, and I don't like the cross, I don't like the self-sacrificial. Like, you end up in really bad places. It doesn't have to be out there in the cosmos. It can be at your farmland in Northern California as you're doing swastika poses, laid out by Miguel Serrano. Like, it can end up there too. And so I hope this book shows you just how wrong men can go. Daily practice of these techniques, page 269, daily practice of these techniques together with a natural diet will eliminate all disease, prevent aging, and raise one's levels of consciousness. Its goal is a self-realized Aryan man god, who is, quote, one with Wotan. What do you say to that? Self-realized Aryan man god who is one with Wotan. Like, he is working really hard to syncretize things that don't belong together, but he's working, Jost Turner, respect to the guy, he's working really hard to do it. This self-development toward the highest state of human evolution also has a cosmological significance. Aryan man is a microcosm corresponding to the macrocosm of the sun and the 12 houses of the zodiac. The spiritual advance of the microcosm has a beneficial effect on the racial group in the outer world during the galactic Wolfe age. By translating notions of white supremacy into a discourse of spiritual evolution, yoga, and the teachings of ancient Hindu Aryan masters, Jost offers a form of racial Odinism closely related to the millennial piety of New Age religion. Through Aryan Kriya, Jost offers a means for Aryan individuals to realize their higher spiritual evolution and thus transcend the present dark age. Quote, Jost Turner, the Siddhas are counting on all of us to use this technique to advance our own evolution so that we can advance the evolution of the world and pull up from its tailspin into degeneracy. End quote, Jost Turner. Aryan Kriya was hardly launched before Jost died of cancer in 1996. And then we go on to David and Katja Lane. Founded by David and Katja Lane, the third group, so Kaldenberg, Jost Turner, and David Lane, and their friend Ron McVan in 1995. Wotan's Volk is a highly prominent racial Odinist group in the United States. Following his conviction for the homicide of Alan Berg while a member of the Bruderschweigen, David Lane was sentenced to 190 years imprisonment. The notoriety of the group and his enormous sentence have combined with his prolific output of revolutionary writings in prison to make him, quote, the best known, I don't know who this is quoting, the best known white political prisoner in the world today. That might be a quote of David Lane's describing himself. David Lane also coined the 14 words motto, quote, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children, end quote, based on the rising tide of color in global population. So if you ever see the number 14 repeated on X, if you see like 1488, 14 stands for the 14 words and 88 stands for HH or Heil Hitler. Anytime you ever see these odd combinations of numbers, particularly 14 or 1483 is another one. The 14 words and 83 being Hail Christ. This was, I believe it was the Jolly Brawler who produced Christmas tree ornaments. Ethan and Samuel Holden, these two guys, they produced Christmas tree ornaments with the Stephen Wolfe Case for Christian Nationalism America with the gold and the cross in the middle and the gold radiating out in the shape of the North American continent, and the numbers 14 and 83 were on opposite coasts of this ornament. The 14 being the 14 words of David Lane, who we're now going to learn about, and 83 being Hail Christ instead of Hail Hitler. I don't recall ever saying Hail Christ in a church service. That's not something we say. But Hail Hitler is 88, 1488. 14 words, Hail Hitler is 1488. 1483 is 14 words and Hail Christ. I might remind you that the White Boy Summer video also had Lincoln Rockwell in it. And some of the guys associated with that crew were the ones who reshared Francis Parker Yockey. quotes on X. So any individual young man might not know where these ideas come from, but there are guys in this movement who absolutely know where these ideas come from. Absolutely, without a doubt. And not enough people want to believe it. They don't want to believe it. They don't want to see it. Hear no evil, see no evil. My bros wouldn't possibly be into that garbage. Nonsense. Yes, your bros are into that. And they're drinking it every single day. And if you care about your bros' souls, you will speak up and you will share this with them. You don't have to share my video with them. You don't have to do that at all. You can buy Black Sun and you can read the Nordic Racial. You can read the book, read it for yourself, and you can share it with them and make them read it. And you can help them see what they're involved in. That's what you can do if you love your bros. You don't just let them go because I don't have time to deal with it. I got other stuff going on. Nonsense, garbage. This is what's happening in the Reform world, which is the one that I have visibility into. I know what's happening in the Catholic world. I know what's happening in the Eastern Orthodox world for sure. This is what's happening. 14 words. 83, 1488, 1483. This is what's happening. This is David Lane. Died in prison, 190-year sentence. Let's find out who David Lane is, shall we? There are a lot of guys in the Reform world who know what the 14 words are and don't really have a problem with them. But let's find out who David Lane is, who wrote them. In the same way, like, if people are into the Enneagram, equal weights and measures. If you're into the Enneagram, look into where the Enneagram came from. You still into it? Once you know what inspired it? Here we go. David Lane, page 270. David Eden Lane was one of 4 children born to an itinerant farm worker in 1938 at Woden, Iowa, hence his pagan nom de plume, Wotan son. By 1943, the father's desertion and family poverty had put the children in an orphanage, where young David was adopted by a traveling youth Lutheran minister and his wife. Subjected to endless hours of services, prayers, and Bible studies, Lane early rejected Christianity and regarded his adoptive father as, quote, an obnoxious buffoon, end quote. During the 1960s, Lane became increasingly disenchanted with mainstream political parties and the betrayal of American commitment to the Vietnam War. A brief association with the John Birch Society introduced him to a conspiratorial view of politics and media power. By 1978, he was convinced that the Western nations were ruled by a Zionist conspiracy, which seeks the extermination of the white Aryan race in order to dominate the inferior races. Lane's thought was thus primarily racialist as a response to the Jews' alleged goal of their racial domination and Aryan extinction. Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Continuing, Lane lost his Colorado real estate broker's license by refusing to sell homes to colored people in white areas, a penalty he attributed to Jewish power. And in 1981, he attracted the attention of the Anti-Defamation League by distributing thousands of copies of his leaflet, quote, The Death of the White Race, in Denver and surrounding towns. David Lane's political education was strongly colored by Christian identity. That's David Lane. That's the guy who wrote the 14 words, and the 14 is appearing on the Christian nationalism ornament produced by the Holden brothers, with the approval of lots of guys in the Christian nationalist movement. That's just who he is. You think that people don't know what's going on? Absolutely, they know what's going on. And if they don't, they got to find out. That's David Lane. I won't sell homes to colored people in white areas, so that he loses his real estate broker's license. Clearly, the Jews have a hand in this. Constantly, page 271, constantly radicalized by a struggle against racial integration and the federal authorities, Lane sees the world in apocalyptic and Manichaean terms. This is the Seattle trial of he was tried in Seattle with other Brutish Schweigen members accused of counterfeiting and of Berg's murder and given 40 years for racketeering and conspiracy. In November 1987, he was convicted in a federal court in Denver of violating Alan Berg's civil rights by killing him and given another 150 years. Constantly radicalized by a struggle against racial integration and the federal authorities, Lane sees the world in apocalyptic and Manichaean terms. After the Seattle trial, Lane defined the order's mission and identity terms as the battle between the divine seed line and the devil's progeny. During his years in high-security prisons at Marion, Ohio, Leavenworth, Kansas, and Florence, Colorado, Lane penned his Aryan revolutionary works to show how the Zionist American establishment was using racial integration backed by the media, education, and a punitive justice system to demoralize and destroy the white race. During these years, his writings increasingly moved away from identity toward a racialist pagan viewpoint, which sees the natural laws of the universe as divine. These laws are essentially defined as the preservation of one's own race, and a race is judged superior or inferior by its will and ability to survive. A people that allows racial aliens to dwell in its midst will perish through racial inbreeding as, quote, This is Lane. No race of people can indefinitely continue their existence without territorial imperatives in which to propagate, protect, and promote their own kind. End quote, Lane. These guys see the world primarily in racial terms. They see it primarily in racial terms. That is the first lens that they see everything through. That is not how we see with Christ's eyes. It cannot be. Not that race or ethnicity, a better word, does not exist. It does exist. We do have people. But the Christian worldview does not call us to see the world primarily in ethnic terms of one's people. It absolutely does not. And that's why you see these white ethnic groups, these white racialist ethnic groups, trying to absorb Christianity and make it their own, because they know that deep down. They know that Christianity, there is no Jew, neither Jew nor Greek, that quote, says that seeing with Christian eyes, we must see beyond the surface distinctions between us. Not that they don't exist. Of course they exist, but we have to learn to see between them. It's a paradox in its own way. Guys hate that. So they want to absorb Christianity and say ultimately that into their white racialist worldview and say this is about us as a people. But then someone else points out Jesus was called rabbi, right? And so we need a scapegoat. So we got to jettison that and go back to Norse racial paganism, Hinduism, Aryanism, right? That's the pattern. Once you start seeing things primarily, first and foremost, through racial categories, down the road, the gospel has to follow, being jettisoned, because you have to choose. Christ forces you to choose. Praise God and hallelujah for that. And so that's what we're seeing. I reject Christianity, reject Judaism, reject Genesis 1 and 2, cosmology, anthropology, and theology. Go looking for something else to justify everything. Find it in occultism, Hinduism, paganism. And what it says. Anger, or being persecuted by an other. We have always been persecuted by this other. They are waging total war against us. The Protocols encapsulates that idea. As a result, we are legitimized in the war that we want to wage back. And so now we are going to gather together to begin to plan how we are going to wage that war. That's the pattern. And that's been going on in the underworld of the internet in America for, at this point, 80 years to varying degrees. And it's this world that lots of Christian pastors with high public profiles have found themselves in this swamp. And they've been breathing the air, and they've been drinking the water, and they've been pandering to men who believe aspects of this, and sometimes not even consciously. And they've invited those men into their digital homes, and they have been captured. And they are trying to pretend that they are still Christians. And not enough good men are speaking up against them. That's what's going on. Read the book. Read the book. Besides, continuing on page 271, besides this deistic naturalism, Lane also wrote on the Western esoteric tradition, utilizing numerology and such occult devices as initiate schools and secret knowledge to trace a hidden heritage in the history of religion. He was a perennialist. Druids, Egyptian priesthoods, Pythagoras and Plato, the Christian Gnostics, Cathars, Knights Templar, Rosicrucians, and other Hermetic philosophers are all deemed initiates or heirs of the mystery religions that have flourished in the first millennium BC, as Odinism, Mithraism, Zoroastrianism, and Gnosticism. He's a perennialist. These mystery or pagan religions pursued a deeper knowledge involving the abstract principle of natural law. Just going to do a little... Does that sound familiar? While the vital forces of the universe were personified in the gods and goddesses of their various pantheons. Disaster struck, this is Lane's account, disaster struck in 325 when the Romans under Emperor Constantine colluded with the Jews to adopt the universal religion of Christianity throughout the empire. The Jews usurped and distorted the wisdom of the ancient mystery schools in order to erect a spiritual tyranny for all time and places in which they would be recognized as, quote, God's chosen people. That's Lane. Lane uses numerology, the coding system of the King James Bible, allegedly written by Sir Francis Bacon, and magic squares to decipher the true universal scheme hidden in the Bible and its pagan mythologies. Very common. It's very common that people who reject a biblical Christian worldview, they can't bring themselves to throw the Bible out entirely, because then they acknowledge, if they're having integrity, this is the one tradition that we're rejecting. We can't be seen to do that. So clearly we have to take in the Bible and say that the Bible doesn't actually say what it says. You have to use the secret code decoder ring to discover what it actually says. And what it actually says is what we believe. This is very common. This is very common because all these guys in this perennialist religions, they recognize that Christianity, biblical Christianity, can't be syncretized. The Bible rejects being syncretized with anything else. So it requires an outside source of authority to interpret what's going on in the Bible so it can be syncretized. And so they try to do this. And then this is why sola scriptura is so powerful. It's like, oh, you're syncretizing the Bible into your worldview? Okay, well, what about you say this passage means, what about this passage? Well, that seems pretty clear. Well, actually, the guys who wrote the Bible were communicating in this really coded language that only initiates can understand. They try that all the time. And then, of course, you get back to the point like, well, the Bible seems pretty clear. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. That seems pretty clear. I've had some arguments with people. That doesn't mean what he says it means. You have to have initiate eyes to understand that. And that's what David Lane is trying to do. So he was brought up in Christian identity, leaves Christian identity as it not being, as adopting too much of a Jewish framework ultimately, but trying to bring the Bible into his worldview because he recognizes it's conspicuous that he's left it out. So much to read. Lane's 272, Lane's overriding concern remains the defensive assertion of white racial survival. He rails against the liberal, multiracial, and race-mixing policies of the white nation-states in North America, Europe, and Australasia, while colored races already account for over 90% of the world's population. Lane states that only 8% of the world's population is white and only 2% is white female of childbearing age or younger, a crucial statistic for the reproduction of the race. Seen in the context of global demography, the inevitable result of affirmative action for so-called ethnic minorities and racial integration in the remaining white homelines is genocide for the white race. In Lane's view, does that sound familiar? In Lane's view, the white race is being denied white ethnic states by the denial of white schools, white neighborhoods, and any other white organizations from maintaining their biological and cultural identity. And just this week, yesterday, Joel Webbin posted a video to his timeline saying, white people, you have a responsibility, you have a duty to stand up for yourselves. That's Joel Webbin. I should cut it in right now.
White people, you have a duty to preserve yourself. Here's what I mean by that. No collective, such as nations or peoples, actually have a right to exist. It's not a real thing, because the mere presence of a right implies an obligation upon everyone else. For example, the nation of Israel does not actually have the right to exist, no matter how many times the neocons tell us that they do. In other words, all the other nations of the world are not obligated to preserve the existence of the nation of Israel. In addition, white people do not have the right to exist. Another way to say it is this: all the other peoples of the world are not morally obligated to preserve the future existence of white people. So here's the point. When referring to collectives, we should properly speak in terms of duties rather than rights. What's the solution? White people need to understand that they have a duty to preserve themselves and their posterity. And therefore, because the population of white people is currently in rapid decline, white people should get married, have multiple children, and use your civic power to fight back against mass invasion and foreign influence in your country. One more freebie that I'll add right here at the end. When you see 75% of advertising in television and on the internet showcasing married couples with black men and white women, on the backdrop of the reality that black men and white women as romantic couples only make up 2% of actual couples in America, you should see that as propaganda, because that's precisely what it is. It is not, in biblical terms, a sin to engage and enter into an interracial marriage. But when all the elites in the political sphere, in the sphere of media, academia, and everything else are constantly pushing for your women to marry non-white men, you should probably understand it's because they hate you. What they're afraid of is you having white babies. And so this reality should probably factor in to your decision for marriage.
Like I said, these ideas are around. Joel Webbin might not know the name of David Lane, but the person who introduced Joel Webbin to these ideas probably does. And now Joel Webbin is laundering them through to a whole bunch of guys, and ain't nobody speaking up about it. Well, that's not true. Of course, plenty of guys are speaking up about it. And if you are a man who speaks up about it, I admire you and I honor you for doing that. And I hope you inspire more men to do that. But this is right now we're documenting where these ideas come from. Don't believe me, read the book. Continuing, racial integration inevitably leads to an increase of interracial matings each year. Joel Webben said that in the video too, which will lead to white racial extinction if unchecked. The 14-word credo, 14 words, is his incessant response to this planned assault on the white race. His militant racialism has earned him the unqualified praise of Colin Jordan as, quote, this is Colin Jordan, an exemplary warrior for the survival and revival of the white peoples of this world, end quote. Colin Jordan, one of the first British neo-Nazis, the guy who explicitly donned Nazi regalia following World War II. That's Colin Jordan. Colin Jordan praising David Lane. David Lane writing the 14 words. The 14 words showing up on the Holden brothers' Christmas ornament. And Joel Webben repeating these exact words, word for word. Word for word. Always resist, continuing on 272, always resisting invasions of racial aliens, the Aryan race has created a civilization comparable to their earlier Roman Empire. Quote, this is Lane, the white race has suffered invasions and brutality from Africa and Asia for thousands of years, declares Lane. So the attempted guilt trip placed on the white race by civilization's executioners is invalid under both historical circumstance and the natural law, which denies interspecies compassion. All races have benefited immeasurably from the creative genius of the Aryan people, end quote. That's Lane. Lane vilifies America under its Zionist occupation government, or ZOG, for a deliberate policy of white genocide over many years. He interprets the Second World War as a Jewish plot to use, quote, this is Lane, the white men of America and England to destroy the racial basis of our ancient European homeland, end quote. Nazi Germany was actually attempting to perform its historic function as defender of the Aryan race, just as it had repelled invading Moors and Mongols during the Middle Ages. The ensuing Cold War with the Soviet Union was a mere hoax to, quote Lane, use America's racially integrated military to mix races near all bases over Europe and America, end quote. Now, this is a totalizing worldview. Lane frequently cites the harrowing examples of enforced racial integration in the United States, such as the 101st Airborne's use of bayonets to integrate Southern schools and the police's use of clubs to beat the white mothers of South Boston when they protested the integration of the neighborhood schools. The government is said to sanction homosexuality and abortion to depress white births. Young white females are constantly bombarded by race-mixing propaganda. Affirmative action displaces whites from employment, and taxes impoverish the whites while financing the breeding of colored races. Summoning images of innocent white children bust into lawless black ghettos, the decay and criminality of urban America, and white flight to the suburbs and country towns, Lane concludes that America is no longer a white country. While the government emits a figure of 70% white, Lane thinks that with Hispanics, Jews, and illegal aliens, America may still be just 50% white. However, in another generation, America will resemble Africa and other colored areas of the world. Quote Lane, the day is coming, if there is not a revolution soon, that American police and military powers under the command of the Jews and comprised of Negroes, Mexicans, Orientals, and vicious race traitors will attempt to murder the last true white men. End quote. That's Lane. In an apocalyptic vision recalling medieval Mongol hordes with herds of captive women, Lane predicts, quote, this is Lane, the last true white women and children will be carried off for recreation and sport. End quote. David Lane, 14 words. If you should see 1488, 1483, and you see anyone talking about the 14 words, or we must secure a future, let's read them again, if I can find them. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. Those are the 14 words. If you see that somewhere, that, what I just described, David Lane, that's who we're quoting. Died in prison. Convicted murderer, racketeering, died in prison. All right, just a few pages left. I think what I'm going to do, I think I'm going to cut this recording here. I think I'm just going to read this entire chapter, and then I will come back, contra what I said at the beginning, I will come back and we'll deal with the conspiracy chapter separately. I hadn't originally planned to do that, but I want to make sure to read this because I think this is really, really important. You know, we've talked about Wyatt Kaldenberg and Jost Turner, and now David Lane, again, the 14 words. I think it's really important that we cover this, and I want to make sure to be able to get this to you guys soon, and then we'll cover the conspiracy beliefs when I don't have to rush my way through it, and then the conclusions. So I'll put those together. We'll do an extra Black Sun reading session that I hadn't planned to do, but that I can do soon, and we'll get that out, because I think this is worthwhile to have on its own. So there you go. So turning to religion, page 273, Lane believes that the white race cannot share gods or religions with other races. That's interesting. Aren't we talking about like Sumeria and Egypt? You know, Hermetics and Pythagoras and Plato and the Rosicrucians, Odinism, Mithraism, Zoroastrianism. Like, does he know about Zoroastrianism? Anyway, alien gods destroy a race's sense of uniqueness and its capacity for its survival. Abandoning Christian identity, he believes Wotanism is the best religion for the white race today. Using terms from mythology and Jungian psychology, Lane declares that Wotan is the best representation of the creative force and folkish needs. Quote, Lane, Wotan awakens our racial soul and genetic memory. He stirs our blood, end quote. Religion should serve the paramount goal of racial survival. Lane contrasts the New Testament's, quote, 10 Commandments for racial suicide, end quote, with Wotan's wisdom for Aryan man. So what I'm going to read you now are Bible quotes from the Gospels, actually, and David Lane's response. This is David Lane, who wrote the 14 words. So here we go. To blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, Matthew 5:5. Lane answers, fortune smiles on a people whose visions are brave, bold, and determined. Concerning sex, quote, whoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery in his heart. That's Matthew 5:28. Wotan's Volk rejoins, quote, if our males do not lust after our women strongly enough to fight to the death for women and territory, then we as a race will perish, end quote. Love your enemies, do good to them which hate you. Luke 6:27 is countered with, quote, again, this is Lane, smite your enemies and the enemies of your people with the hammer of Thor. Feed their bodies to vultures in the marketplace, that your next enemy depart in fear, end quote. For Lane, religion is ultimately a political weapon. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, says Mark 12:10, to which Wotan's Volk, or Lane, replies, quote, cut off Zog's head and feed it to the dogs. Government beyond the consent of the governed is tyranny and theft, end quote. That's David Lane of the 14 words. I am telling you, if you think people who are into all this white racial stuff don't know who these guys are, that they don't know what they're doing, they're just boys playing around with ideas. False. They're boys playing around with toxic waste that someone handed to them. Absolutely. They did not come up with these ideas and these memes on their own. Miguel Serrano, Savitri Devi, Julia Savola, Francis Parker Yockey, Lincoln Rockwell, Wilhelm Landig, David Myatt, Ian Stewart Donaldson of Screwdriver, all these guys have been around, writing massive volumes on their worldviews. And they've been there. And now we're talking about Wyatt Kaldenberg, Jost Turner, and David Lane. This is the world of ideas that these young men have been exposed to. And they have thus exposed major influencers to it. And they are now expressing these worldviews, attempting to launder it in Christian-sounding terms under Christian banners. And it just is not Christian. They can pretend that they can separate the meat from the bones, maybe, but they're eating rotten meat and it's poisoning them. That's just what it is. They won't ever cop to it. They just won't. But that's what's going on, because that will require them to vomit up the entire worldview. And for men's pride, that's way too much. That's way too much. Now, I pray if you're listening to this and you've been exposed to these ideas, that you repent and that you think about the communities that you've been a part of, where you've seen bros laughing about the 14 words. Maybe you didn't know. Now you know. Maybe you heard guys talking about David Lane. Maybe you heard them talking about, I don't know, Julius Evola, probably. Maybe you heard the term Kali Yuga. Maybe you saw some Norse runes, you know. Maybe you heard a little bit of discussion of Asa True, which I'm told that Patriot Front discusses. The whatever group, the white supremacy ethnic group, white ethnic supremacist group, Patriot Front talks about Asa True. Maybe you've just seen all this stuff and you didn't know what it was, and you just wanted to be around a bunch of bros who seemed like they were going places and doing things. And look, I'm just sorry to tell you, these are the origins of all the ideas. And, oh, I care about my people. Yeah, sure. I understand that. I understand that. I know that family and friends and all of that is important, but you got to find a way to do this. That ain't like that. That ain't like that. And so, I want to say it was C.S. Lewis. It might not have been. It was probably someone like him who said, the thing that you love has to die and be buried to rise again in service. And then of course Christ said, take up your cross and follow me, die to yourself. And so start there. Start there with your personal piety and see what happens. Because there are guys marching to a bad drummer. There's some Pied Piper stuff going on. And now that hopefully you can hear the tune, you can just decide, I ain't going that way. Doesn't mean you got to know the exact precise every single step of the way that you're going to walk next. But I'm going to tell you, scripture reading, all of scripture, prayer, church attendance and membership, and confession to a godly pastor is a good start. It's a good start. You can find forgiveness. I believe it. And I encourage you to do that. Trust me. Continuing. Ron McVan is the one who worked with the Lanes to add artistry. One of the reasons David Lane became so influential is that he was working with Ron McVan. Ron McVan has developed Wotan's Vogue artistic, devotional, and philosophical content. According to McVan, we're on 274, Wotanism is rooted in the white race's genetic character and collective identity. Quote, this is McVan, our ancient white ancestors understood that to ensure our heritage and racial survival, expansion, and advancement, we must initiate means to galvanize our folk consciousness. Allegories and myths were developed along with a variety of archetypal gods which best represented nature's law and the collective unconscious of the folk. Foremost and most consistent among all these archetypes was the Teutonic god Wotan. End quote. That's McVan. Describing Wotanism as, quote, again, the inner voice of the Aryan soul, quote, McVan relates how the eruption of, again, there's that word eruption, of the Wotan spirit united and transformed the German people with, quote, again, this is McVan, an amazing and almost instant iron will and productivity, end quote, in the 1930s. The Wotan spirit has been notably quiescent in the decades following 1945, when a deliberate genocide of the white race, its culture and traditions was launched in multiracial states. However, McVan sees, quote, a metamorphosis of the gods, end quote, taking place in our time, a, quote, calling of the blood, end quote, because all Aryans to a greater or lesser degree still retain an element of Wotan consciousness. This spirit is their protectorate and strength, and, quote, Lane, the surest means to unify our common purpose and destiny, end quote. Wotan. We're going to get into Jung. We're going to get into Jung in just a minute and what he said about all of this, an eruption of the spirit of Wotan. And you can understand it because it's a substitute God the Father, right? Wotan, Odin, right? It's a similar thing, seeking after a father figure, a godlike father figure. So I reject the God of the Bible and Jesus Christ, his son, because they're of the Jews, an alien race is what he's saying. I'm going to reject that God of the Father, and so I'm going to look for another God of the Father, and I'm going to find it in Wotan. And Wotan is our true Father God, and that is the one we are going to venerate and honor in opposition to the tyranny of the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's what he's talking about. Wotan's Volk, back on 275, Wotan's Volk sees its mission as a continuation of the earlier efforts of such individuals as Richard Wagner, Friedrich Nietzsche, Guido von List, and Carl Gustav Jung to restore the Aryans to their potent collective unconscious. This is apostasy. We are going to throw out our Christian heritage and we are going to rediscover Wotan, our true Germanic white racial Aryan heritage. Wagner, Nietzsche, Guido von List, and Carl Gustav Jung. It's an eruption of the Wotan spirit is what inspired the Nazis. And we're going to see more of that in just a minute. This revival, we're on page 275, this revival of Teutonic mythology was enhanced further by Wagner's inspirational music and Nietzsche's heroic philosophy, which cast new light on, quote, the long-suppressed Aryan consciousness, end quote. That's McVan. McVan recounts how Wotanism and Ariosophy were rediscovered by Guido von List and Jorg Lons von Liebenfeld, and their example was followed by Karl Maria Willigut, Rudolf von Sabotendorf, Theodor Fritsch, and Dietrich Eckart. You may remember that name. Hitler's mentor, I believe Eckart's name was referenced at the end of Mein Kampf in the 1920s, I believe, who forged a new Aryan self-consciousness among the Germans in anticipation of National Socialism. Guido von List, Wotanism and Ariosophy were rediscovered by von List, Liebenfels, Willigut, Sabotendorf, Fritsch, and Eckart, who forged a new Aryan self-consciousness among the Germans in anticipation of Nazi National Socialism. So Wotanic worship was a necessary precondition of National Socialism. Our people, Germany for the Germans, our people, our gods, our father god, not the God of the Bible, the god Wotan. Very clever little substitution, right? Very clever little swap going on there. And also, I might add, the Barmen Declaration was drafted to reject how Christianity had been subsumed into the National Socialist, the Nazi state. So they had placed Nazism at the top, and Christianity was intended to serve Nazism. So the Barmen Declaration was drafted to push back on that. So, and you can see probably why. You're rejecting the God of the Bible. This is a Germanic tradition in the 1800s that feeds into this as well. German higher criticism sort of hollowed out Christianity in such a powerful way. But we're going to substitute with our Wotanic, Odinic vision of who God is. Not this Jewish version. Not this Christ. This Jewish Christ, right? So all these pieces kind of begin fitting together. Page 275, Wotan's Volk inspiration in the work of Carl Gustav Jung, is primarily attributable to his famous essay of 1936, in which he described the Wotan archetype as an autonomous psychic factor producing violent and restless effects in the collective life of the Germans. Jung, 1936, Wotan archetype as an autonomous psychic factor producing violent and restless effects in the collective life of the Germans. Jung recalled the earliest signs of its outbreak before 1914 and the German youth movement with its sun worship, solstice rituals, and pagan symbolism. Earliest signs in 1914, prior to World War I, he's seeing this eruption of the Wotan archetype is beginning in 1914. Sun worship, solstice rituals, and pagan symbolism. Essay of 1936. But after 1933, Jung saw the enthusiastic masses of the Third Reich as being seized by the full flood of the Wotan archetype after centuries of its repression. 1933, the Third Reich being seized by the full flood of the Wotan archetype. It is erupting. Again, there's the third use of this word, erupting out of the Germanic consciousness. In a letter, listen carefully now, in a letter written to Miguel Serrano in 1960, to Miguel Serrano, there's a whole book of correspondence of letters between Jung and Serrano. I referenced it earlier. It's on Amazon. Many reviews, well-known book. It's been translated into many different languages. So, in a letter written to Miguel Serrano in 1960, Jung expanded on the perennial potency of the Wotan archetype. This extended quote is now Jung. When, for instance, the belief in the god Wotan vanished and nobody thought of him anymore, the phenomenon originally called Wotan remained. Nothing changed but its name, as National Socialism has demonstrated on a grand scale. Nothing changed but its name. A collective movement. Again, he's writing in 1960, a collective movement consists of millions of individuals, each of whom shows the symptoms of Wotanism, and proves thereby that Wotan in reality never died, but has retained his original vitality and autonomy. Our consciousness only imagines that it has lost its gods. In reality, they are there and still, and it only needs a certain general condition in order to bring them back in full force. So he is diagnosing, going back to 1916 and then again in 1933 and then writing in 1960, that the Wotan archetype A non-Christian pagan god erupted out of the German national consciousness, seized them. Certain general condition to bring it back in force. Okay, here we go. This is really important. Page 276. Turning to the post-war present, Young then commented, this is 1960, Young then commented that the weakness of Orthodox Christianity, note that, and the challenge of communism, note that, placed the world in a similar spiritual predicament to pre-Nazi Germany in the 1920s. Quote, this is Jung, we are apt to undergo the risk of a further Wotanistic experiment. This means mental epidemic and war, end quote. The weakness of Orthodox Christianity and the challenge of communism placed the world in a similar spiritual predicament to pre-Nazi Germany in the 1920s. We are apt to undergo the risk of a further Wotanistic experiment, mental epidemic or sickness and war. That's Carl Jung writing in the 1960s. That is exactly what I've been saying, and multiple different times. The weakness of Orthodox Christianity not pushing back on bad ideas and the specter of communism, those two things together. Communism is just out there doing its thing, and Orthodox Christianity is weak. It is weak. How is it weak? It is weak in defending doctrine. This is true, like life practice kind of stuff, orthopraxy, Francis Schaeffer, but it is also proving itself weak in that it is failing to defend against the eruption of this Wotanist ideology. David Lane, 14 words. Francis Parker Yockey, Miguel Serrano, Lincoln Rockwell. There's more than one way to be weak. You can be weak and not standing up to the left. Yes, you can do that. You can also be weak and not standing up to the right. That is another form of weakness. Carl Jung diagnosed it back in 1960. Carl Jung was a pagan, but he called it. And so Christianity needs to find its spine and diagnose exactly what's going on. And Christians need to stand up and say, no, that is wrong. That is evil. And I don't care if you bully me. I don't care if you call me names. I don't care what you think. I don't care if I lose my friends. I don't care if I lose my bros. I don't care if I lose money. This is wrong. This is evil. And I'm standing up in opposition to it. Because Wotan is rising again. Only this time he's trying harder to wear a Christian mask. And I've said it multiple times in this conversation. Not enough people are standing up. Not enough Christians are standing up. Read the book. All right. Continuing, 276. We're getting very close to the end here. And so I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to wrap up this episode here, and I'll cover the conspiracy chapter separately because I think it's important enough to do that. And so I'll do that. And because I want you to be able to listen to this and not get overwhelmed and really consider what's going on here. So, and for those of you who are listening on Substack, I will put the Joel Webben tweet, which just went around like yesterday. I will embed it in the article that I include with this. So for those of you who are watching on YouTube, I'll drop the full video into the middle of this video. I'll just drop it in. Meaning you can watch and you can actually listen to him say these things and you'll see them on YouTube. For those of you that are going to listen quickly on Substack to make the editing faster, I'll just put it in the Substack article and you can look at it. It'll be right above and next to this video, and you can see it for yourself. So this is so I can turn it around quickly. Continuing on 276. Wotan's folk literature approvingly quotes Jung on Wotan, but omits any mention of his dire warnings after the Nazi era. So that bit that I said about the weakness of Orthodox Christianity and the challenge of communism, he meant that as a warning. Go figure. In this respect, Wotan's Volk identifies with an early Jung, who supposedly drew inspiration from contemporary irrationalism and Volkish nationalism. In his controversial books, which I would like to read, Richard Knoll has related Jung's early intellectual development to the neo-romantic intellectual climate of German Findecyclic culture, end of the century. Neo-romantic intellectual climate. That is entirely what Nazi ecology by Mark Musser is about. When pessimistic notions of decline and decadence, the Findecyclic culture, were matched by Nietzschean calls for rebirth and renewal. So, decline and decadent, end of the century culture, end of the 1800s. We're talking end of the 1800s, when pessimistic notions of decline and decadence were matched by Nietzschean calls for rebirth and renewal. This is the end of the 1800s and going into the 1900s, well before National Socialism. Okay, each of the following sentences is really important. Following explorations of spiritualism and theosophy, Jung became interested in the Aryan Mithraic religion and the solar mysticism of German Volkish nationalists. This is early Jung, from Richard Knoll. Jung borrowed evolutionary biologist Ernst Haeckel's theory that stages of individual development recapitulated the individual evolution of the human race in order to articulate his own evolutionary theory of the unconscious. So Jung is borrowing from Ernst Haeckel, which you will hear me talk about in the introduction to the Mark Musser podcast. Ernst Haeckel, I also spoken about him in a video that I did about evolution, that Ernst Haeckel wrote to Charles Darwin. And so Ernst Haeckel helped undermine Orthodox Christianity in Germany in the 1800s through his biology. And Carl Jung borrowed Haeckel to talk about evolutionary theory of the unconscious. So again, no Christian anthropology. To Jung, fantasies and dreams recorded the prehistoric and ancient religious experience of mankind. In 1909, so this is early Jung set about excavating the unconscious of his Swiss and German patients in light of the ancient Aryan mystery religions and their solar symbols. So he's going into the subconscious of his patients to find mystical religion. If Jung initially had regarded the eruption of the unconscious strata of the mind as a pathology, by 1916, he believed that the conscious mind could only be revitalized by cutting through the repressive Christian overlay of European civilization to the archaic pre-Christian levels below. So in 1960, Jung is warning people about the weakness of Orthodox Christianity, but in 1916, 44 years prior, he's saying we need to cut through the repressive Christian overlay to the archaic pre-Christian levels below. So he's talking about this Wotanic eruption, but he contributed to it. That's Carl Jung from the books of Richard Knoll, Noll. Wotan's Volk, this is returning to Goodr Clark, celebrates Jung as seen by Knoll, the rediscoverer of the Aryan mysteries of the European peoples, especially the Germans, before the imposition of an alien Semitic Christianity that severed them from their primordial sources of life, their gods, myths, and archetypes. Using Jung's imagery of archetypal eruption, McVan claims that, quote, now this is Ron McVan, Jung predicted that the Aryan race would soon enter a resurgent age of Wotan, who would rise within the folk conscious mind of his people like a dormant volcano to new activity, end quote. Again, eruption. Only through a spiritual act, quote, now this is McVan, in which the white race rediscovers its myth and legend, end quote, can Aryan man survive as a species. And so McVan recreated full Wotanist rites of blot, which if you've been in the masculinity conversation and been around Norse pagans, they've talked about blot, and sumbul, or toasting. His impressive wooden sculptures of Norse gods and goddesses, wolves, dragons, and ravens are scattered over the headquarters site at St. Marie, together with a wooden temple or hof dedicated to the memory of Guido von List. Page 277, we're almost done. Wotan's Volk religion offers a spiritual and ceremonial dimension in support of Lane's strident insistence on Aryan power, propagation, and survival, and it is notable in this context that the 14-word press has issued its own edition of Ragnar Redbeard's Might is Right. But Wotan's Volk also recommends song, dance, and meditation to bring Aryan men and women into harmony with cosmic energies. McVan's most recent publication, Temple of Wotan, Holy Book of the Aryan Tribes, 2000, is a lavishly illustrated large-format repertoire of Wotanist sacred rites, art, poetry, and runes, and it includes the full text of C.G. Jung's Wotan essay. This Wotanist, quote, Bible is dedicated to Miguel Serrano, who also supplies the foreword. Here, Serrano dilates on Wotanism as the original religion of the divine Aryans. Ron McVan, artist associated with David Lane, connected with Miguel Serrano. I've been telling you. The volume also Serrano recalls the Externsteine in Germany as a major shrine in the importance of the German SS and reviving the cult at the nearby Wewelsburg. The volume also contains reprints of the young Serrano correspondence, including the prophetic letter already quoted. In Wotan's Volk, Serrano appears to have found a major promoter in the English-speaking world. year 2000, as the internet is beginning to achieve widespread adoption. The 14-word press, David Lane, has recently published the first English-language edition of Serrano's The Golden Chain, Esoteric Hitlerism. David Lane, 14 words, 14-word press, publishing Miguel Serrano. There's your connection in the year 2000. So if you don't believe me that Miguel Serrano's ideas have now shown up, esoteric Hitlerism, in the internet age, in the age of memes, there's your connection, because David Lane, author of the 14 words press, publishing Miguel Serrano. There it is. There it is. Page 277. We're almost done. In its racial focus on immigration and white submergence, latter-day Wotanism sees the loss of white ethnic identity as the main consequence of globalization. Wotan's Volk rejects metropolitanism and large-scale industry as the causes of congestion, immigration, and race mixing, pollution, and rampant crime. Led astray by rationalism and materialism, modern man feels that he must ceaselessly consume manufactured products so that the machines that enslave him may grow. Wotan's Volk demonstrates its tribalist antipathy toward economic liberalism by arguing that folk community living is the sole antidote to disorders of life in overpopulated and polyglot cities. Volkishness, cooperation, kinship, and constructive emotions, along with a simplified, unstressful lifestyle, are essential factors for the development of a healthy race. How does that work? All that hatred, and you should have kinship and constructive emotions and a simplified, unstressful lifestyle? Like, how do you get there out of hatred of immigration and race mixing? Like, you see, they recognize on some level that their worldview is ultimately destructive. So we just need to be crazies for a little while, but we're just going to get back to the land and we're going to be at peace. No, it don't work that way. I'm sorry. It don't work that way, because when you're just going to retreat to the land, then you're still going to have creeping modernity, right? That's why the Volkish ideas ultimately turn militant and violent, because you recognize there's no place to hide. So it must, from being separatist, must ultimately become defensive, and then it must ultimately return offensive. And these communities are separatist, and they post a lot of offensive, as in we're going to go on offense, which leads them to the attention of the authorities, which is why they're on defense, which is why they can never quite escape and build the world that they want to live in, because they're always looking over their shoulder. Because inside, their views are based on hatred, whatever kind of serene lifestyle they want. Jost Turner believed that through Kriya Yoga, we could ultimately achieve of peacefulness and all is one, but he had to go to Hinduism to get that, right? And so these men ultimately recognize the flaws in their worldviews, and they're forced to look somewhere other than the Bible, which has the only answers. They have to throw it out. And so they're fishing around forever looking for something that isn't there, hoping that no one points these things out. And, I don't know if Goodrick Clark is trying to do that here, but I don't think it's below his level of perception to note the irony in what he's talking about. So now we're going to quote, I believe we're quoting McVan here. The world struggle for the future is only now just beginning. As the sickness of this lost society becomes too much to bear, the need for neo-tribalism and a return to our folk gods will become ever more apparent. To this, the Aryan path of Wotanism provides a dynamic storehouse of ancestral knowledge and ethnic identity. End quote. Returning to Goodrick Clark. In its opposition to cities, liberalism, and international capitalism, Wotan's Volk revives the idyll of rural Volkish utopias sought by early 20th century German pagans. So there's a big effort in the Christian world right now. By the way, we're going to wrap this up here. We're going to stop with this chapter. I'm going to let this stand alone because I think this stuff is really important, and we're going to do an unexpected bonus 7th session about the conspiracy chapter, because we're 2 hours in right now, and that will take another 2 hours. But I think it's worthwhile to be able to spend the time on it. Obviously, I don't want to rush through it, and I can't rush through it right now, even if I wanted to. So I'm going to let this chapter stand. You're going to get a bonus video out of all of this. But just real quick in conclusion, the word Volk and Volkishness has become very, very popular in the modern political dialogue alongside the people that are talking about natural law. They talk about Volk and Volkishness. You've heard that word over and over and over again here. Now, I don't think Goodrick Clark is making the point that everyone who says that word believes the things that I'm talking about here. However, the discussion of Volkish, kindred, style, ethnically homogenous living on the countryside has a long history and lineage and tradition of some very bad anti-civilizational, anti-Christian, and anti-Jewish ideas. So that's the history. Like, oh, we're not part of all that. We want to have a Christian a white Christian Volkishness, right? We want to go have our white Christian thing over here. Not like we don't want other races and Jews here. We just want this to be a white Christian thing. Well, are you Christians or are you Volkists, right? Because these guys are talking honestly about the Volk, right? And then Christian Identity tried something similar. They tried warping Christianity, distorting it to make it about white people so they could have their own separatist communities. We talked about that in the last episode. And so there's this very uncomfortable attempt to harvest things out of National Socialist and pre-National Socialist Germany without and trying to be like, no, I'm just going to scrape off the paganism, and I'm going to scrape off the dirt, and I'm going to scrape off the blood and the bullet casings. I'm going to scrape all of that off and like, see, there's this thing, and I can just have that. But the guys who we're talking about here, they are a testimony to that might be a flawed idea. That might be a pretty flawed idea. You might be trying to do something where the internal gravity of it pulls you in the direction that you already feel, this instability. And it's going to force you to collapse. Are you about your people or are you about Christ? One has to be first. You can't have them both. You can't have parallel traditions. Well, my people and Christ are of equal importance. No. Christ, to take every thought captive. Take it. That's what it says. So Christ has to come first. And so there's an attempt to make this really uneasy synthesis. And, you can say some people who were early Volkish people, in Germany were okay about it. But even Carl Jung's observing, and I think it was like 1913, I think is what we said, that there was, let me pull it up actually. Let me see if I can find it. There's Jost Turner. Here we go. Page 275. Jung recalled the earliest signs of its outbreak, the Wotan archetype. Jung recalled the earliest signs of the Wotan archetype outbreak before 1914 and the German youth movement with its sun worship, solstice rituals, and pagan symbolism. After 1933, Jung saw the enthusiastic masses of the Third Reich as being seized by the full flight of the Wotan archetype after centuries of its repression. In 1909, this is on page 276, Jung set about excavating the unconscious of his Swiss and German patients in light of the ancient Aryan mystery religions and their solar symbols. If Jung had initially had regarded the eruption of the unconscious strata of the mind as a pathology, by 1916 he believed that the conscious mind could only be revitalized by cutting through the repressive Christian overlay of European civilization to the archaic pre-Christian levels below. This was already going on. And you can look up the Wandervogels. That's the German youth movement. I think that was part of the German youth movement. You can look up the Wandervogels and you can look up the Artemannens. They were right in parallel with the Volkish movement and what was going on in Germany. And a lot of the attempts to harvest this Volkishness is dependent on you not looking too deeply into the paganization of Germany leading up to the National Socialists. And again, that is why I commend to you, if you're enjoying Black Sun, and I'm sure a few of you out there are, I commend to you Nazi Ecology by Mark Musser. And I will link his interview in the show notes. I commend to you this book because that is what he wrote about. The paganization of Germany through, I believe, the 18th and 19th century leading up into the Nazi era. And he talks about the Volkishness, and he talks about the German Romanticism and German Romantic idealism and German higher criticism and all of the nature worship and pagan symbolism that was erupting out of the German consciousness leading up to the National Socialist Germany. And so the attempt to launder even pre-Nazi, pre-National Socialist German ideas into the modern era has some very troubling roots and is very liable to produce some very troubling fruits. I'm no mind reader. I'm no fortune teller. I'm just telling you that if you're trying to harvest ideas out of pre-National Socialist Germany and National Socialist Germany and say that You can separate the meat from the bones. I hate to tell you, the meat is already poisoned. It's already rotting. And if you don't know that, then you have to go find out. And if you do know that, then you need to repent. So this is why we read. This is why we read books. This is why we turn off Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Snapchat. This is why we don't listen to podcasts. I don't listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to mine, by the way. But this is why we read books. This is why we read Black Sun. This is why we read Nazi Ecology. This is why we read Warrant for Genocide. This is why we read The Plot by Will Eisner. This is why we read William F. Buckley, In Search of Anti-Semitism. This is why we read Jean Paul Sartre, Anti-Semite and Jew. This is why we read these books, so that we understand the roots of the ideas that we are now currently swimming in. And I'm grateful and very thankful that you're listening, so that I can read this book to you. And maybe together we can help shatter some of the illusions and delusions and madness and, spiritual illness that's going on right now. I believe we can. And I believe we can do that together. But again, as I always say, don't take my word for it. You can read Black Sun for yourself. So thanks for the opportunity to record this, and I look forward to getting together next week and talking about the chapter on conspiracy beliefs in the New World Order. I think we will be having another very provocative discussion then. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate you all, and God bless.